Hello there, and welcome to History for Lunatics. I am so glad you're here tonight. Find somewhere comfortable, let the room settle around you, and prepare to walk through a part of New York that spent more than a century collecting stories faster than respectable people could deny them. Tonight we are going to the Bowery, a street whose name once carried a warning. It could mean entertainment, cheap food, music, work, violence, loneliness, temptation, or a bed for the night, depending on how much money you had in your pocket and how confidently you walked beneath the lights. Before we step into it, tell me something. What time is it where you are, and where are you listening from tonight? Perhaps you're in a quiet bedroom, perhaps on a couch with the lights turned low, or perhaps you're listening from a city where the streets outside are still busy. Wherever you are, imagine for a moment that the sound beyond your window is not traffic as you know it. Imagine horse carts striking uneven pavement, iron wheels grinding above your head, men calling from doorways, music escaping through thin walls, and a steam train passing so close over the street that hot cinders fall toward the sidewalk. That is where we are going. If this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you enjoy entering the past through ordinary streets and the people who filled them, it would mean a great deal to me if you subscribed and gave this video a like. You do not have to interrupt your evening to do it immediately. Wait until something in the story makes you stop and picture the place. Then, if you remember, you can do it. For now, let us begin in New York sometime in the 1890s, when the Bowery was already famous, already crowded, and already carrying the reputation that would follow it for generations. Picture yourself standing near Chatham Square after sunset. You're at the southern end of the Bowery, looking north along a broad street that seems unable to decide whether it is a commercial avenue, an amusement district, a transportation corridor, or one long argument between respectability and disorder. The street extends roughly 1.25 miles toward Cooper Square, but at night it feels longer because every block presents another crowd, another doorway, and another reason to slow down or keep moving. Above you stands the structure that changed the street almost as dramatically as any theatre, saloon, or gang. The 3rd Avenue Elevated Railway began operating along the Bowery in 1878. Its iron columns rose from the roadway, carrying steam trains above the shops and pedestrians. The railway made it easier for people to reach the district, but it also placed much of the street beneath a permanent ceiling of iron. Daylight struggled to reach the pavement. At night, the lamps and bright windows shone beneath the tracks while smoke gathered around the beams. Passing locomotives rattled buildings, interrupted conversations, and scattered hot cinders toward people below. The Bowery had always been busy, but the elevated line gave it a new physical character. It became louder, darker, and more enclosed, as though the city had built a second street directly above the first one, and left everyone underneath to compete for air and attention. The noise would be the first thing you noticed. It did not come from one source. It came from everything at once. A train approached above with a growing metallic roar. A wagon driver shouted at a horse that had stopped in the roadway. A theatre employee stood beneath a painted sign announcing the evening performance. A newsboy called out the latest headline. Somewhere behind a swinging door, a piano was being played hard enough to reach the sidewalk. Men laughed. Glass struck wood. A police whistle sounded farther down the block, and then disappeared into the rest of the street before you could determine what had happened. The Bowery was not quiet, even when nothing was wrong. Now look at the buildings. Many were narrow, 4 or 5 stories high, with businesses on the ground floor and rooms above. Some had begun as respectable houses earlier in the century. Wealthier New Yorkers had once lived along this road. But as the city expanded northward, families with money moved away from the growing congestion. Their former residences were altered, divided, and converted. A parlour became a saloon. Bedrooms became rented rooms. A ground floor became a shop selling clothing, tools, tobacco, or cheap meals. The street did not erase its past so much as reuse it, one wall and staircase at a time. After the Civil War, the Bowery became especially well known for inexpensive amusements. Music halls, dramatic theatres and German beer halls operated beside pawn shops, dive bars, dance halls, medicine shows and dime museums. Some establishments offered legitimate entertainment to working families. Others sold something less respectable behind a respectable sign. A museum might advertise an unusual animal, a sword swallower, a performer with an extraordinary physical condition, or a woman wearing less clothing than reformers believed any woman should wear in public. The Bowery did not insist that entertainment be refined. It only insisted that people pay before entering. That distinction matters, because the people on the street were not simply criminals and drunks, despite the way newspapers and later films often portrayed them. The Bowery was also one of the principal avenues used by working-class New Yorkers. Clerks, labourers, mechanics, sailors, factory workers, apprentices, domestic servants, immigrants, and small shopkeepers passed through it every day. Some lived in the surrounding tenements, others rented beds in boarding houses. Many worked long hours and came to the Bowery because its entertainments were priced for people who could not afford the opera houses, restaurants or hotels of wealthier districts. A worker might spend 10 or 12 hours lifting goods, cutting cloth, driving a wagon, preparing food, or tending machinery, then arrive on the Bowery with a few coins and the understandable desire not to return immediately to a crowded room. The street offered warmth, company, alcohol, music, food, and the chance to remain awake in a city that often treated leisure as a privilege. It did not ask for a formal coat. It did not ask for a family name. Most places did not care where you had come from as long as you could pay for a drink or a ticket. This was part of the Bowery's attraction, and also part of what frightened respectable observers. The street allowed different worlds to touch. A labourer could sit near a gambler. A sailor on shore leve might drink beside a local politician supporter. An immigrant who spoke little English could enter a theatre and hear familiar music or language. An uptown visitor could come downtown to stare at all of them. By the 1890s, Yiddish, Italian and Chinese theatres had joined the older German beer halls and Irish-American music halls around the Bowery. Saloons, dance halls, tattoo parlours and dime museums added to the crowds. The district drew not only local residents, but also curious visitors from other parts of New York and tourists from outside the city, some of whom joined organised slumming excursions to observe working-class and impoverished neighbourhoods as though poverty were an evening performance arranged for their education. There is something uncomfortable about that image. A well-dressed group could arrive in a carriage, guided by someone who promised to show them the dangerous Bowery, while the people they had come to observe were trying to earn wages, find supper, avoid arrest, or secure a place to sleep. The visitors wanted a thrilling story to tell afterward. The residents had to remain when the tour was over. Imagine one of those visitors stepping onto the sidewalk and trying not to appear nervous. His coat is clean. His shoes have not walked through many Lower East Side streets. He has heard that the Bowery is filled with thieves, confidence men, violent gang members, prostitutes, and desperate men who might knock him down for the contents of his pocket. Some of that fear is exaggerated, some of it is not. He holds his walking stick a little tighter and looks too carefully at everyone around him, which may be the fastest possible way to reveal that he does not belong there. A man approaches and offers to show him a better establishment around the corner. Another recommends a gambling room where a fortunate newcomer can supposedly double his money. A woman smiles from a doorway. A ticket seller promises a performance unlike anything available uptown. The visitor has entered a district where nearly every promise requires payment, and where the difference between entertainment and theft may not become clear until much later. Confidence men understood that greed and embarrassment were useful tools. The easiest victim was not always the most innocent man. It was often the man who believed he was too clever to be cheated and too respectable to admit afterward where he had gone. The Bowery supplied many opportunities for such transactions because strangers arrived expecting adventure. They wanted to see something forbidden. They wanted to return safely. The people selling the experience understood both desires. Yet even here, the street was more complicated than its worst doorway. A few buildings away from a saloon, there might be a bank designed to assure depositors of stability and seriousness. The Bowery Savings Bank, completed in the 1890s, presented grand architecture to a street commonly described as disreputable. Other institutions, including banks, religious organisations and the YMCA, also established substantial buildings along the avenue. The result was not a neat division between good blocks and bad blocks. Respectability and disorder stood beside each other, sometimes sharing a wall. That may be the most important thing to understand about the Bowery. It did not become notorious because every person on it was dangerous or every business dishonest. It became notorious because opposites were packed together so tightly that no one could control the meaning of the street. It was a place of pleasure and desperation, commerce and fraud, performance and survival. A visitor could leave a theatre laughing, step around a man sleeping near the entrance, pass a mission offering prayer and food, and then enter a saloon where a fight had already begun. The Bowery Mission had opened in 1879, part of a growing effort to reach impoverished and homeless men in the district. Rescue missions offered religious services, meals, shelter, and the possibility of reform, though their methods could be strict and their language toward the poor was not always gentle. Their presence revealed how visible hardship had become. Charity workers did not choose the Bowery because poverty was hidden there. They chose it because the need stood in line outside the door. Keep walking north and watch the crowd change from one block to the next. Near a theatre entrance, families and groups of workers gather under bright signs. Near a saloon, men stand in clusters, talking politics, boxing, wages, local gossip, and whatever happened during the day. Outside a cheap restaurant, the smell of onions, meat, coffee and frying fat reaches the street. At a pawn shop window, watches, tools, coats, musical instruments, and personal possessions sit behind glass waiting for someone to buy them, or for their owners to find enough money to reclaim them. A pawn shop tells the economic history of a neighbourhood without writing anything down. A carpenter pawns a tool after several days without employment. A widow leaves a piece of jewellery when rent is due. A man who has lost money drinking sells his coat and regrets it the next morning. Another buys that coat cheaply before winter. The objects move from hand to hand, and the shopkeeper earns money from the distance between necessity and value. Then there were the lodging houses. During the middle of the 19th century, boarding houses along the Bowery often served young single workers arriving in New York. They were not automatically treated as places of shame. A man came to the city, found employment nearby, rented a room, ate with other boarders, and began building a life. As the century continued, however, the lowest end of the lodging business expanded. By 1890, one historical estimate placed more than 9,000 homeless men in lodgings on the Bowery. The quality varied enormously. A man with 25 cents might obtain a room with clean sheets. 7 cents could buy a hammock in a windowless basement. 5 cents might secure nothing more than a place on a wooden floor. Try to imagine making that decision late at night. You have a few coins left. You need food, but you also need a place to lie down. A proper bed costs more. A floor costs less. The weather outside is cold and the elevated structure blocks what little sky you might otherwise see. You count your money beneath a street lamp while people move around you. No one considers this moment historically important. It is simply one tired man deciding what kind of discomfort he can afford. This is where the Bowery's reputation began to harden into something larger than the street itself. New Yorkers used its name as a shorthand for falling. A man who had lost his job, family, savings, or health might be described as ending up on the Bowery. The phrase suggested that there was nowhere lower to go. It turned a real district filled with thousands of different lives into a final destination in a cautionary story. But the people living there did not arrive through one doorway. Some had come to New York looking for work and failed to find steady employment. Some had been injured. Some struggled with alcohol or illness. Some had left families or been abandoned by them. Some were recent immigrants without local connections. Others were older men who had worked for decades and discovered that age could remove a labourer from the economy with very little ceremony. The The street gathered people whom other neighbourhoods had no interest in seeing. Newspapers helped create the legend because the Bowery produced stories that sold copies. A fight, robbery, raid, fire, suspicious death, or scandalous performance could be described with enough colour to entertain readers who would never willingly spend a night there. Reporters wrote about gang members with memorable names and saloons with terrible reputations. Reformers described dark rooms, overcrowded lodgings, and children surrounded by vice. Police officials announced campaigns to close disorderly establishments. Each account added another layer to the idea that the Bowery was not simply a street, but a separate moral climate. The gangs were real, though later retellings often blurred the difference between political clubs, volunteer fire companies, neighbourhood associations, and organised street violence. The famous Bowery boys of the mid-19th century were associated with working-class nativism and the rough political culture of the city. They cultivated a recognisable appearance and a reputation for fighting. The Bowery also stood near the edge of 5 Points, whose rivalries and conflicts repeatedly spilled into surrounding streets. During periods of unrest, including the Civil War draft riots, neighbourhood gangs could participate in violence that went far beyond ordinary barroom disorder. Still, most nights were not riots. That is easy to forget because calm evenings rarely enter the historical record. Thousands of people walked the Bowery without being robbed. Workers attended performances and returned home. Friends met over beer. Immigrant families heard music from places they had left behind. Actors performed several shows a day. Bartenders washed glasses. Cooks worked in hot kitchens. Policemen leaned against posts and watched familiar troublemakers. Lodging house keepers collected coins. Mission workers prepared food. Newsboys fell asleep wherever they could. The ordinary life of the street continued beneath the reputation. Let us stop for a moment under the elevated tracks and look upward. A train passes overhead. For several seconds, conversation becomes useless. The iron structure shakes. Smoke and sparks move through the darkness. When the train has gone, the street noise returns as though someone has lifted a heavy lid. You can hear music again. You can hear a man advertising beds. You can hear glasses and laughter from an open door. Now look farther north. The Bowery does not disappear into darkness. It continues in lights, signs, and movement. That may be why it became so difficult for New York to reform. The street was not a single problem that could be removed. Close one saloon, and another opened. Arrest one confidence man, and someone else learned the trade. Improve a lodging house, and desperate tenants still needed the cheapest bed. Send missionaries into the district, and the theatres remained full. The Bowery existed because the city around it kept producing the workers, customers, entertainers, migrants, homeless men, and curious outsiders who filled it. New York liked to pretend that the Bowery was an exception, a dangerous strip that had somehow developed bad habits on its own. In reality, it was one of the clearest products of the city's growth. It showed what happened when enormous numbers of people arrived, when wealth rose quickly, when rents remained high, when labour was uncertain, and when commercial entertainment learned to sell excitement to anyone with a nickel. The Bowery was not outside New York. It was New York without much effort to hide the machinery. By midnight, the crowds would thin in some places and gather in others. A respectable family would already be home. A theatre audience might spill onto the pavement. Men without rooms would begin looking more urgently at lodging house signs. Bartenders would decide who had spent enough and who had become a problem. Police officers would watch the entrances they knew best. Somewhere, a train would still pass above the street, carrying passengers who look down briefly through dirty windows before moving north. Stand there long enough, and the Bowery begins to feel permanent, as though it had always been crowded with saloons, theatres, pawn shops, cheap rooms, gangs, reformers, immigrants, and men sleeping under its shadow. But none of this was inevitable. Long before the elevated railway darkened the street, Before the beer halls, before the Bowery boys, before the lodging houses and the missions, this was a road leading away from a much smaller town. Its name did not originally suggest crime, poverty or nightlife. It came from farms. To understand how a rural road became the most notorious street in New York, we have to leave the 1890s behind, let the trains and theatre music fade, and follow the Bowery backward to a time when Lower Manhattan ended much farther south, and this route led through open land toward fields, country estates, taverns, and the long road out of the city. Long before the Bowery became a street of crowded theatres, loud saloons, cheap lodging houses, and men sleeping beneath an elevated railway, it was a road leading away from town. There were no electric signs, no iron tracks overhead, and no shopkeepers standing beneath awnings trying to draw customers inside. The lower end of Manhattan was occupied by a small settlement surrounded by water, woodland, marshes, farms, and rough open ground. North of that settlement, a path followed the natural shape of the island, bending around hills and wet places instead of cutting through them. People had used that route before New Amsterdam existed, before Dutch ships entered the harbour, and before anyone called the island Manhattan on a European map. To understand the Bowery before its reputation took hold, we need to stand on that path sometime in the middle of the 17th century. The air is quieter, though not necessarily peaceful. There are insects near the wetlands, birds in the trees, and the movement of people carrying goods between the small town and the farms beyond it. The road is uneven. In dry weather it is dusty. After heavy rain it becomes soft and deeply rutted, especially where wagon wheels have passed repeatedly over the same ground. The route had developed from a Native American trail extending through Manhattan. One early name associated with it was the Wickwasgeck Road, referring to the people and territory north of the Dutch settlement. When the Dutch began establishing farms beyond New Amsterdam, the old path became the practical connection between the town at the southern end of the island and the cultivated land farther north. Enslaved labourers widened part of it so wagons, livestock and farm workers could move more easily. It became known as the Road to the Boweries, using the Dutch word for farms. Over time, English speakers changed Bowery into Bowery. The name that would later suggest danger and poverty began as a simple description of where the road went. Imagine walking north from New Amsterdam in the 1640s. The town behind you is still small enough that leaving it does not require much effort. You pass beyond the main cluster of houses, warehouses, workshops and taverns. The defensive wall that would eventually give Wall Street its name has not yet created the firm boundary people later imagined. The settlement is growing, but the distance between town and countryside remains short. The road curves northeast to avoid a large freshwater pond known as the Collect. The pond is an important source of water, although the land around it can be muddy and difficult. Streams and marshes spread through parts of the surrounding area. The straight lines of the later city have not yet appeared. There is no canal street, no neat arrangement of numbered blocks, and no expectation that every hill, pond and meadow will eventually be flattened, drained, or covered by buildings. A wagon moving along the road might carry grain, vegetables, milk, firewood, or barrels from the farms toward the town. Another could be returning north with tools, cloth, salt, or imported goods unloaded from ships. Cattle and pigs are driven along the route, sometimes willingly and sometimes with the stubbornness that animals have demonstrated throughout human history. A drover can spend half an hour trying to persuade one animal to continue moving while the rest of the herd creates a problem somewhere else. The road is not merely a passage through empty countryside. Farms and small holdings appear on either side, and their history is more complicated than the peaceful rural image suggests. Between 1643 and 1651, several formerly enslaved Africans received grants of land in the area between the wagon road and the Collect Pond. Some had been enslaved by the Dutch West India Company and were released under a system often described as half-freedom. They could live on their own land and earn wages, but they still owed payments and labour to the company and the freedom granted to parents did not necessarily extend to their children. The farms they established formed part of a community of black landholders north of New Amsterdam, positioned between the Dutch town and the less developed interior of Manhattan. This part of the Bowery's history is easy to miss because the later street became so strongly associated with European immigration and 19th century urban poverty. Yet some of the earliest residents along the road were African men and women attempting to build households under a colonial system that could change the terms of their freedom whenever those in power found it convenient. They cleared land, planted crops, raised animals, built homes, and travelled the same road into town to trade or fulfill obligations. A person walking past one of these farms might see corn, beans, livestock, fenced plots, and a modest house built from available materials. Nothing about the scene would reveal the legal insecurity beneath it. A family could work land that appeared to be its own, while knowing that colonial officials still claimed authority over its labour and future. The road carried produce toward New Amsterdam, but it also carried orders, taxes, rumours, and decisions made by people who rarely performed the work themselves. Dutch officials and wealthy settlers controlled larger estates nearby. The Boweries were originally established in part to supply the colony with food. New Amsterdam depended heavily on ships, but a settlement could not rely forever on every necessary item arriving across the Atlantic. Grain had to be grown, cattle had to graze, timber had to be cut, beer required ingredients and equipment. A colony built around trade still needed someone to milk cows before sunrise. Among the most prominent landowners was Peter Stuyvesant, the Director General of New Netherland. In 1651 he purchased the large farm often called the Great Bowery. His estate spread across a substantial area east of the road, far beyond the compact town. He built a country residence there and spent his later years on the property after the English takeover. The farm included fields, orchards, barns, a house and a chapel. Stuyvesant was eventually buried near the site where St. Mark's Church in the Bowery would later stand. It is worth pausing over the fact that Stuyvesant considered this area the countryside. The land around present-day East Village streets, now surrounded by apartments, restaurants, traffic, and constant movement, was once far enough from the centre of New Amsterdam to serve as a country estate. Reaching it required leaving town and following a farm road north. A visitor did not casually step outside for a short walk and find himself there. He travelled. Stuyvesant's house stood near the East River, away from the busiest part of the road. From the property, the family could look across fields and water rather than brick walls. Farm workers, servants, and enslaved people carried out the daily labour that made the estate function. Fences needed repair. Animals had to be fed. Crops required planting and harvesting. Firewood had to be cut in quantities large enough to carry the household through winter. The road linked estates belonging to other powerful Dutch families as well. Names such as Beekman, Delancey and Stuyvesant later became attached to streets, neighbourhoods, institutions and buildings. But in the 17th century they belonged to families whose land stood outside the main settlement. Their farms were not remote in the way a frontier homestead could be remote, yet they occupied a different world from the crowded southern tip of Manhattan. In 1664, English forces took control of New Amsterdam and renamed it New York. The flags changed, the government changed, and English gradually replaced Dutch in official life. But the road remained useful. That is one of the quiet truths about cities. A government can rename a place in a day, but it cannot easily persuade cattle, wagons and travellers to abandon the route that already works. Under English rule, Bowery Lane became part of the larger post road connecting New York with settlements to the northeast, eventually including the route toward Boston. Mail riders, stage wagons, merchants, soldiers, farmers, and ordinary travellers used it. A person leaving New York by land might pass along the Bowery before continuing through Upper Manhattan and beyond. The street's later identity as a destination had not yet formed. For now, its importance came from movement. It carried people away from the city and brought others in. Travel on the post road was slow by modern standards, and comfort was never guaranteed. A stage wagon could jolt over holes, lean into ruts, and stop because of weather, broken equipment, tired horses, or poor road conditions. A journey described confidently as taking a certain number of hours might take far longer. Travellers learned not to treat a schedule as a promise. Along such roads, taverns became essential. They provided food, drink, beds, information, and space for business. A tavern was not simply a place where men went to become drunk, though that certainly happened. It could function as a meeting room, informal post office, hiring place, political gathering point, and centre of trade. News travelled through taverns because travellers carried it. So did gossip, illness, arguments, and unpaid bills. By the 18th century, the lower Bowery was becoming increasingly connected to New York's livestock trade. One of its best-known establishments was the Bull's Head Tavern, built around the middle of the century near the area between present-day Canal and Bayard Streets. Cattle yards, slaughterhouses, tanneries and butcher shops operated nearby. Farmers and drovers arriving from outside the city brought animals to market, while butchers negotiated purchases and prepared livestock for sale. The tavern provided a place to conduct business, eat a meal, drink, and wait while animals were inspected or moved. Picture the road on a market morning. Long before theatres and music halls produced the Bowery's famous noise, there was the sound of livestock. Cattle crowded into yards. Pigs resisted being driven in any orderly direction. Horses pulled wagons loaded with meat, hides, barrels, and farm goods. Butchers shouted prices. Drovers shouted at animals. Dogs moved around the edges, either helping or creating additional confusion. The smell would be difficult to ignore. There was manure in the roadway, blood near the slaughtering areas, smoke from fires, wet leather around the tanneries, and the usual collection of odours produced by horses, people, kitchens, drains, and open ground. New York was still small, but small cities were not automatically clean cities. Much of daily life happened close to animals, waste, and standing water. Inside the Bull's Head Tavern, the room might be crowded before noon. Men discussed livestock prices over mugs of beer or rum. A farmer who had spent days bringing animals toward New York hoped to receive enough money to make the journey worthwhile. A butcher tried to pay less. Someone offered information about another herd coming down the road. Someone else claimed to know where prices would be next week, which may have been true, or may have been the 18th century version of a man in a bar explaining an investment he did not fully understand. This surrounding district remained partly rural, but the city was moving toward it. Each year, the distance between the settled town and the farms seemed a little shorter. Houses and workshops appeared along the road. Land that had once been used for crops became more valuable as building property. Owners divided estates into lots. What had been a route through the countryside slowly became a street with permanent residents. The American Revolution interrupted this growth and placed the Bowery within a military landscape. New York's location made the city strategically important, and the surrounding roads carried soldiers, supplies, and information. After British forces took New York in 1776, they occupied the city for the remainder of the war. Farms and houses beyond the old centre were used, damaged, abandoned, or altered by military needs. Residents faced shortages, displacement, disease, fire, and the constant presence of troops. The Bowery was no longer simply a pleasant approach through farmland. It became one of the routes through which military power entered and left the occupied city. Loyalists, British soldiers, prisoners, refugees, merchants and civilians all moved through the area. When the British evacuation finally came in November 1783, George Washington entered New York with American forces. The Bull's Head Tavern is traditionally associated with his movements during those days, and the road that had served farms and the British occupation now carried the victorious commander into the returning American city. The event did not instantly repair New York. Buildings had been damaged, trade disrupted, and the population unsettled. Victory did not remove the practical work of rebuilding. During the years after the Revolution, the Bowery entered a period that seems almost strange when compared with its later reputation. Parts of it became fashionable. Merchants, butchers, craftsmen, and prosperous families built houses along the route. The lower Bowery developed brick and brick-fronted residences, shops, taverns, and commercial buildings. Some structures combined business and domestic life, with a shop on the ground floor and the owner's family living above it. One surviving example was the house built for butcher Edward Mooney in the late 1780s near Chatham Square. Mooney had prospered through the livestock and meat trades closely associated with the district. His house reflected the Bowery's changing position. This was no temporary cabin beside a country road. It was a substantial urban building belonging to a man whose business connected farms, markets, slaughterhouses, and city consumers. The road had helped create his livelihood, and now his house helped make the road look more like a city street. Consider an evening there around 1790. The street outside is busy, but it has not yet earned its later reputation. A merchant returns home. Shopkeepers close shutters. A wagon arrives later than expected. Someone leads horses toward a stable. The buildings are low enough that the sky remains visible. There are taverns, certainly, and there are fights, thefts, drunkenness, and prostitution, because those existed in every port city. Yet a respectable New Yorker can still give a Bowery address without expecting raised eyebrows. This was a period when the old road held several identities at once. It remained a path for goods entering the city. It was still connected to livestock and slaughtering. It served travellers using the post road. At the same time, it was becoming residential and commercial. Families lived above workshops. Butchers worked beside tavern keepers. Carpenters, blacksmiths, grocers, and small manufacturers found customers among the people moving along the avenue. The city's physical growth accelerated after 1800. New York's population increased, trade expanded, and land north of the old colonial centre became more valuable. The Collect Pond, once a defining feature near the lower Bowery, had become badly polluted by nearby industries and waste. Officials decided to drain and fill it. The process created unstable ground and serious drainage problems, but it also allowed streets and buildings to spread across land that had previously blocked development. The straightening and formal naming of streets gave city government a stronger role in shaping the area. On August 23, 1813, the Common Council officially placed the name the Bowery on the city's records. New Yorkers had used versions of the name for generations, but the official designation marked a change. The Farm Road was now recognised as an urban street. The choice of name preserved a memory that was already becoming difficult to see. The Boweries were disappearing beneath houses, shops, workshops, and streets. The farms that had given the road its name were being divided and sold. Stuyvesant land remained farther north and east, but the lower Bowery no longer felt like the countryside. The city had followed the road and begun consuming the landscape around it. New transportation increased the flow. Stagecoaches and omnibuses used the wide avenue. Carts brought food and materials toward the markets. Travellers arriving from the north entered New York through a corridor increasingly lined with businesses ready to sell them meals, drinks, rooms, clothing, tools, and entertainment. That last word matters. Entertainment did not suddenly appear on the Bowery because the neighbourhood became immoral. It appeared because the street had what entertainment businesses needed: traffic, workers, travellers, available buildings, and customers with small amounts of money to spend. Taverns already offered more than food. Public rooms hosted meetings, performances, political gatherings, and celebrations. As the population grew, entrepreneurs recognised that a large audience lived within walking distance. By the 1820s and 1830s, brick row houses stood along much of the avenue. The lower Bowery was crowded with stores and homes. Respectable families still lived there, but the character of the street was shifting. Commercial activity occupied more ground floors. Traffic became heavier. The old estates continued to retreat northward. What had once been a road between town and farm was now one of the main routes through a rapidly expanding city. Imagine one of the older residents looking out from an upstairs window during those years. He remembers when cattle had dominated the road and fields could be seen beyond the houses. Now he sees shop signs, coaches, labourers, apprentices, peddlers and strangers. He hears arguments from the tavern and construction from the next block. The change has happened gradually enough that no single morning marks the moment the countryside disappeared. A few doors away, someone is preparing a room for a performance. Benches are being placed in rows. Lamps are checked. Musicians arrive carrying instruments. A painted sign is hung outside where passing workers can see it. The admission price is kept low because the Bowery's audience is not made up entirely of wealthy families. It includes clerks, mechanics, sailors, tradesmen, apprentices, and young men living in rented rooms. The road has already done the difficult part. It has brought the crowd together. Now the buildings along it are learning how to keep that crowd from going home. The buildings along the Bowery had learned how to keep the crowd from going home, and by the 1820s there was enough money moving through the street for someone to attempt something much larger than a tavern performance or a rented room with benches. On October 23, 1826, a new theatre opened near the lower end of the Bowery. Its first name was the New York Theatre, although people soon knew it simply by the street outside its doors. Designed by the architect Ithiel Town, it presented a broad Greek revival front with tall columns and enough seats for roughly 3,000 spectators. At the time, it was among the largest theatres in the country. The building did not look like a place created for mechanics, apprentices, firemen, and young men living in boarding houses. It looked grand, expensive, and determined to compete with the most respectable theatres in New York. Imagine arriving on its opening night. Carriages stop in the street. Lamps burn at the entrance. Men in good coats help women step over the mud. Inside, attendants guide the audience toward boxes, galleries, and the crowded pit in front of the stage. The first programme includes a comedy called The Road to Ruin, a title that would later sound almost too well chosen for a theatre on the Bowery. At this moment, however, no one believes the new playhouse represents decline. It represents confidence. New York is growing, its merchants are earning money, and the city wants places where that money can be displayed after dark. The original investors hoped to attract wealthy patrons who were accustomed to attending the Park Theatre near City Hall. That audience expected imported plays, celebrated actors, formal manners, and enough distance from the poorest parts of the city to feel comfortable. The new theatre's owners believed the Bowery was developing quickly enough to support a similar establishment. They were correct about the growth and mistaken about the audience. Respectable theatre-goers did come, but not in the dependable numbers needed to fill 3,000 seats night after night. The building was too large to survive on prestige alone. Empty seats produced no income, regardless of how impressive the columns appeared outside. Managers lowered prices, changed the programs, advertised more aggressively, and began paying closer attention to the people who already lived and worked around the Bowery. Those people wanted theatre, but they did not necessarily want the theatre offered to wealthy New Yorkers. A carpenter who had spent the day shaping wood did not always want to sit silently through a long imported drama chosen because a critic approved of it. A butcher, printer, blacksmith, cart driver, sailor, volunteer fireman, or factory worker might prefer action, recognisable heroes, physical comedy, patriotic speeches, music, animals, fights, storms, fires, and villains whose wickedness did not require careful interpretation. He wanted to see something happen. The Bowery Theatre began providing exactly that. By the early 1830s, under the management of Thomas Hamblin, the Playhouse developed a strong working-class identity. Melodramas became central to its success. These productions offered clear conflicts, emotional scenes, sudden danger, and satisfying moments when virtue confronted cruelty. Some featured frontier settings, shipwrecks, military battles, escapes, horses, dogs, elaborate scenery, and special effects involving smoke, water, or fire. The theatre also booked circus performers, dancers, singers, animal acts, and other attractions that respectable critics sometimes dismissed but large audiences willingly paid to see. The Bowery was becoming a theatre for the city's working population, while the Park Theatre increasingly represented elite culture. The difference could be heard before it could be seen. An audience at the Bowery Theatre did not regard silence as a moral duty. People talked during the performance, they shouted encouragement to favourite actors, they hissed villains and performers they disliked. They called for a song to be repeated. They argued with one another about what was happening on stage. Men smoked, moved between seats, and visited drinking areas during the programme. A performance was not treated as a sealed object delivered by actors to a passive room. The audience believed it was participating. An actor who pleased the crowd might be rewarded with applause loud enough to stop the production. An actor who failed could receive advice from several hundred people at once, none of it requested. If a scene seemed slow, the gallery made its opinion known. If a patriotic line was spoken with sufficient force, men in the pit might rise and cheer. The boundary between the stage and the room was thinner than it is in most modern theatres. This atmosphere could be exhilarating, intimidating, and occasionally dangerous. The crowd contained young working men who were accustomed to defending their standing in public. Many belonged to volunteer fire companies, political clubs, trade organisations, neighbourhood groups, or informal street associations. They did not leave those loyalties at the door. A dispute over an actor, a song, a political remark, or a seat could spread through the audience. Theatre was entertainment, but it was also one of the places where working-class New Yorkers displayed who they were and what they believed. Walt Whitman, who remembered the old Bowery theatre-going world, described an audience packed from the ceiling to the pit, and composed largely of vigorous American mechanics. He did not see them as an ignorant mob. He saw men who worked, read newspapers, followed politics, admired actors, and formed strong judgments about what appeared before them. Their manners were rougher than those expected in an uptown box, but their attention was real. The plays increasingly reflected that audience. Working men appeared as heroes. American frontiersmen defeated enemies through courage and practical intelligence. Sailors survived corrupt officers and violent seas. Firemen rushed into burning buildings. Patriots defended the country against foreign threats. A recurring stage figure known as the Bowery Boy wore recognisable working-class clothing, spoke in neighbourhood slang, moved with exaggerated confidence, and behaved as though every street belonged to him until someone proved otherwise. Audiences laughed because they knew the type. Some of the men watching probably believed they were the type. The theatre also participated in entertainments that carried the racism of 19th century American popular culture. Blackface minstrelsy appeared on Bowery stages, presenting cruel caricatures of black speech, music and behaviour for white audiences. These performances became enormously influential and helped spread stereotypes that lasted far beyond the buildings in which they were first performed. They cannot be separated from the history of the Bowery's entertainment culture. The street offered working people access to public amusement, but some of that amusement depended on humiliating people who had less power than the audience buying the tickets. Nothing made the Bowery Theatre's physical vulnerability clearer than fire. The building burned repeatedly during the 19th century and was rebuilt again and again. The first major fire came in 1828, only a short time after the theatre had opened. Other destructive fires followed in 1836, 1838, and 1845. Each rebuilding produced another theatre on or near the same site, often larger or more elaborate than the one before it. A theatre was almost designed to burn, It contained timber, canvas scenery, painted cloth, ropes, curtains, costumes, lamps, gas lines, crowded passages, and hundreds or thousands of people seated close together. Stage effects added further danger. A flame used to create excitement in a battle scene did not understand that it was supposed to remain theatrical. When fire broke out, there was little time for calm consideration. Smoke moved through the upper galleries. People pushed toward narrow exits. Fire companies raced along the street pulling heavy engines by hand. Crowds gathered to watch, because New Yorkers have never required much encouragement to stand near a public disaster. The building might be lost within hours, leaving only walls, debris, and a manager already thinking about reopening. Rebuilding the Bowery Theatre was partly financial stubbornness and partly recognition that the audience remained. The structure could disappear, but the appetite for entertainment did not. Notices went into newspapers. Investors were found. Workmen cleared the ruins. Another auditorium rose, and people returned to see what had changed. The theatre's success encouraged other entertainment businesses to open nearby. Smaller playhouses presented drama, comedy, music, and variety acts. Concert saloons combined drinking with stage performances. Dime museums promised unusual sights for a low admission price. Medicine shows mixed entertainment with salesmanship, offering songs, jokes, demonstrations, and remedies said to cure conditions that the customer may not have known he possessed until the lecturer explained them. The term museum could be used very generously. A Bowery museum might contain stuffed animals, wax figures, mechanical devices, performers with unusual bodies, supposed artifacts from distant places, sword swallowers, magicians, dancers, or an animal advertised with a description more exciting than accurate. The customer paid a small coin to enter and remained as long as curiosity survived. Some attractions were genuine, others depended on low lighting, confident announcements, and the useful human desire to believe that one has seen something extraordinary. A visitor could move from a dramatic theatre to a concert saloon, from the saloon to a museum, and from the museum into a tavern without leaving the same few blocks. The Bowery became New York's first major working-class entertainment district because it gathered amusements at prices ordinary people could sometimes afford. After the Civil War, the number and variety of these businesses increased. Music halls, dramatic theatres, German beer halls, dive bars, pawn shops, medicine shows and exhibition rooms stood beside one another, competing for the same stream of pedestrians. Now let us step away from the theatre entrance and cross into a different kind of evening establishment. The room is larger and less formal. Long tables extend beneath a high ceiling. Waiters carry glasses through narrow spaces between benches. Musicians are preparing on a raised platform. Children sit beside adults. Men speak German over the noise of the crowd. Women have come with relatives and friends. This is not the secret drinking room imagined by reformers when they use the word saloon. It is a German beer hall, and for thousands of immigrants living east of the Bowery, it is one of the most familiar public spaces in New York. German immigration transformed the Lower East Side during the middle decades of the 19th century. By 1840, more than 24,000 Germans lived in New York. Another large wave arrived during the following 20 years, driven by unemployment, land shortages, famine, and political or religious pressure in Europe. A broad neighbourhood developed east of the Bowery and north of Division Street. Residents called it Klein Deutschland, or Little Germany. By 1880, its German-speaking population exceeded 250,000, making it one of the largest concentrations of Germans outside Europe, and roughly a quarter of New York's population. Most families lived in apartments that offered little space for gathering. Rooms were crowded. Summer heat could make them nearly unbearable. A labourer who worked in a bakery, brewery, cigar factory, cabinet shop, clothing workshop or piano factory did not necessarily want to spend his only free evening sitting beside a bed while several relatives tried to sleep. The beer hall supplied another room. Some establishments were modest neighbourhood places. Others were enormous, decorated halls with stages, meeting rooms, billiard tables, bowling alleys, ballrooms, and space for singing societies, labour organisations, political clubs, fraternal lodges, and family celebrations. German theatre could be performed on a small stage. A brass band might play while customers drank. A choral society could rehearse in one room, while a union discussed wages in another. On Sundays, whole families gathered to meet friends, hear music, drink beer, and dance. These halls were not merely businesses selling alcohol. They were extensions of a community whose homes were often too small to contain its social life. The Atlantic Garden, opened by Wilhelm Kramer at 50 Bowery in 1858, became one of the best-known German establishments on the street. It stood close to the Bowery Theatre and occupied ground already associated with public entertainment and hospitality. The property extended deep into the block, allowing the business to include a large beer hall and performance space rather than only a narrow barroom facing the street. Concerts and variety entertainment accompanied the drinking, and the establishment became a recognised centre of German social life. Picture the Atlantic Garden on a busy Sunday evening. The entrance from the Bowery opens into a room bright with gaslight. Smoke hangs beneath the ceiling. Glasses strike the tabletops. A band begins a familiar tune, and conversations pause just enough for people to recognise it. Older immigrants know every note. Younger family members know the melody, but may answer their parents in English. A waiter carries several glasses at once, gripping the handles with a skill learned through repetition and occasional failure. Someone moves a chair to make room for another family. A political organiser passes quietly between tables, greeting men who may be useful during the next election. Two members of a singing society argue about rehearsal. A child becomes tired and leans against a parent while music continues. The beer itself matters, but it is not the entire reason people have come. They are there because the room permits a version of public family life that many Anglo-American taverns do not. Men, women, and children can attend together. Music and conversation reduce the distance between the old country and the new city. The hall allows an immigrant to spend an evening in New York without surrendering every familiar custom at the door. To an outsider, the place may appear foreign. To the people inside, it may be the least foreign room they have entered all week. The Bowery benefited from its position along the western edge of Little Germany. Workers finishing their shifts in nearby factories and shops could reach it easily. So could residents of boarding houses, sailors arriving from the waterfront, and visitors travelling from other parts of Manhattan. The audience changed according to the establishment and the hour. Early in the evening, families might dominate a beer hall. Later, groups of young men became more visible. Theatre crowds entered and left in waves. Employees working after midnight joined customers who had no urgent reason to sleep. Gaslighting extended the commercial day. It did not make the Bowery as bright as a modern avenue, but it allowed businesses to advertise themselves after sunset. Light shone through windows and over entrances. Painted signs announced performances. Men stood outside calling attention to the attraction within. Each doorway tried to separate one customer from the moving crowd. The street developed its own rhythm. Before a performance, people hurried toward the theatre. Once the curtain rose, nearby sidewalks briefly thinned. During intermission, drinking places filled. At the end of the programme, several thousand people could emerge within minutes, looking for food, transportation, another drink, or further entertainment. A restaurant owner understood that he did not need to create the crowd. He only needed to position his doorway where the crowd would pass. Vendors sold food that could be eaten quickly. Oyster saloons served customers late into the evening. Coffee rooms, cheap restaurants, and lunch counters offered meals to workers whose schedules did not match the respectable household dinner hour. A printer leaving a night shift, an actor finishing a performance, and a policeman beginning duty might all seek food at nearly the same time. This is how a street acquires the reputation that it never sleeps. It does not require every building to remain open until morning. It requires one group to replace another before the pavement becomes empty. Theatre audiences leave as late workers arrive. Bartenders close one room while bakers begin work nearby. Lodging house residents stand outside because the sleeping rooms are too hot. Newspaper employees carry fresh additions into the street. Delivery wagons appear before the final drinkers have gone home. By the 1870s and 1880s, the Bowery's amusements had become cheaper, more varied, and more aggressive in their competition. Harry Minor opened a Bowery theatre devoted to popular variety entertainment in 1878. Other establishments followed similar methods, presenting a rapid sequence of singers, comedians, dancers, acrobats, specialty performers, and short dramatic scenes. The customer did not have to follow a complicated story for 3 hours. If one act failed to please him, another would appear soon. The audience could also change languages by walking several blocks. As new immigrants settled around the Lower East Side, Yiddish, Italian and Chinese performances joined older German halls and Irish-American music venues. By the 1890s, Yiddish theatre had become especially important in the Bowery district. The old Bowery Theatre, operating under later names including the Thalia, presented productions to Jewish audiences who had arrived from Eastern Europe. Biblical dramas, comedies, family stories and works dealing with immigration allowed spectators to hear familiar languages while confronting the confusion of life in America. Inside one of these theatres, the emotional connection between audience and stage could be immediate. A character struggled with an Americanized child who rejected the customs of the family. Someone in the gallery recognized the argument because it had occurred in his own apartment that morning. A song recalled a town left behind. A comic actor exaggerated the difficulties of speaking English, finding work, or understanding American behaviour. The room laughed because the embarrassment was shared. The Bowery was giving immigrant communities public stages, but it was also changing those stages through the pressure of the city. German halls presented American acts. Yiddish companies adapted European traditions to New York audiences. Variety theatres borrowed performers from every available form of entertainment. Boundaries between music, drama, circus, comedy, salesmanship and spectacle became increasingly difficult to maintain. Respectable reformers disliked much of this. They saw drinking, gambling, sexual commerce, vulgar performances and mixed crowds. They worried about young men spending wages before returning to their families. They worried about young women entering dance halls. They worried about children seeing behaviour that could not be explained politely. Some concerns were justified. Fraud, exploitation, drunken violence and prostitution were part of the entertainment economy. Other complaints came from discomfort with working people enjoying themselves without supervision from those who believed they knew what proper leisure should look like. The Bowery did not ask permission from those observers. On a Saturday night, its sidewalks filled with people carrying the wages of the week. Most had only a small amount available after rent, food and other necessities. The businesses lining the street understood that those coins had to be captured quickly. Admission prices were painted in large figures. Music reached the pavement. Employees offered promises at the door. One place claimed a celebrated performer. Another advertised a shocking exhibition. A third offered beer, dancing, and no need to sit quietly. The crowd made choices 1 nickel, dime or glass at a time. Near midnight, the family groups had largely departed from the beer halls. Chairs stood out of place. The floors were marked with dirt brought in from the street. Musicians continued for customers who had no children to carry home. Theatres released their final audiences. Actors removed costumes in cramped rooms behind the stage. Stagehands lowered scenery, extinguished lights, and prepared equipment for the following day. Outside, the Bowery remained active. Men gathered in saloon entrances. Political workers moved between familiar establishments. Volunteer firemen, prize fighters, gamblers, thieves, confidence men, and ordinary labourers used the same sidewalks and sometimes the same tables. The amusements had created the crowd, but the crowd had brought other kinds of business with it. A street filled with theatres and beer halls required people who could control doors, settle arguments, collect debts, protect performers, arrange gambling, influence police officers, and decide which strangers were welcome. Some of those men worked officially. Others carried authority that appeared nowhere on a payroll. The music continued, the glasses continued to move, and beneath the bright signs another Bowery was taking shape. One ruled less by actors and musicians than by saloon keepers, gang leaders, ward politicians, and men whose reputations could clear a section of sidewalk before they had spoken a word. The music continued, the glasses continued to move, and beneath the bright signs another Bowery was taking shape. One ruled less by actors and musicians than by saloon keepers, volunteer firemen, political organisers, prize fighters, and men whose names carried enough weight to settle an argument before the police arrived. Some of them were criminals, some held ordinary jobs. Many moved between both worlds so easily that the distinction did not mean very much after dark. Let us stand on the Bowery sometime in the early 1850s. The elevated railway has not yet been built, so the sky remains open above the street. Horse-drawn vehicles move through the roadway. Gas lamps shine outside theatres, hotels and drinking places. The sidewalks are crowded with men leaving workshops, markets, firehouses and evening performances. Among them is a figure New Yorkers have already learned to recognise. He wears a high black hat, polished carefully and placed almost straight on his head. His hair is oiled. A cigar rests at the corner of his mouth. His shirt collar is turned outward, and his clothing has been chosen to make his shoulders appear even broader than they are. Heavy boots strike the pavement with each step. He does not hurry, because hurrying might suggest that someone else has authority over where he is going. This is the Bowery Boy. The word did not describe one formal organisation with a membership list and regular meetings. It referred more broadly to a type of young working-class New Yorker associated with the Bowery's theatres, saloons, fire companies, trades and street culture. He might be a butcher, mechanic, clerk, printer, carpenter, cartman or shop worker. He followed politics closely, attended popular theatre, admired physical courage and expected respect from strangers. He could be loyal to his neighbourhood, generous to friends and quick to join a public fight that had nothing to do with him 5 minutes earlier. The stage character, Bose the Fire Boy, helped turn this local type into a national image during the 1840s. Audiences laughed at his slang, his enormous confidence, and his willingness to challenge anyone who questioned him. Bose was exaggerated for the theatre, but the men in the Bowery galleries recognised the posture, clothing, and behaviour. Some enjoyed the performance because it made fun of them. Others enjoyed it because it made them look powerful. To an uptown visitor, every young man dressed this way could appear to belong to a gang. The reality was less orderly. Groups formed around streets, trades, fire companies, political clubs, saloons, and personal loyalties. Names changed. Alliances shifted. A man might fight beside one group during an election and against some of the same men over a fire hydrant several months later. The word gang was useful, but it could hide as much as it revealed. The Bowery Boys became the most famous of these associations. They were generally native-born, Protestant and hostile toward the growing Irish Catholic population concentrated in nearby 5 Points. Many were connected with volunteer fire companies and nativist politics. They presented themselves not as common criminals, but as defenders of American workers against immigrants whom they believed were taking employment, political influence, and control of the streets. Their opponents saw them as organised bullies using patriotism to excuse violence. Both descriptions could be true at the same time. The conflict was intensified by geography. The Bowery stood close to 5 Points, one of the poorest and most crowded districts in the city. Thousands of Irish immigrants had settled there after fleeing famine and poverty. They entered a city that needed their labour, but often treated their religion, accents, and poverty as evidence that they did not belong. Irish gangs and political groups formed partly for protection, and partly for the same reasons other street organisations formed: companionship, employment, influence, and access to power. The Bowery boys and groups identified with 5 points did not spend every day fighting one another. Men still had jobs, families, rents, and meals to worry about. Yet election days, public celebrations, fires, funerals, and personal disputes could bring the rivalries into the open. A small argument became an ethnic argument. An ethnic argument became a political argument. Once friends arrived from nearby saloons, the original cause was often forgotten. Volunteer fire companies stood near the centre of this street culture. Before New York established a professional fire department, much of the city depended on companies of volunteers who pulled engines through the streets by hand. Their work required strength, speed, and courage. Buildings were crowded together. Construction materials burned quickly. Fire could spread across rooftops while residents carried possessions onto the sidewalk and watched their homes disappear. When an alarm sounded, volunteers left workshops, taverns, theatres and beds. They ran toward the firehouse, seized ropes attached to a heavy engine, and dragged it toward the smoke. The work could save an entire block. It could also become a public contest between companies determined to reach the fire first. A fire company had its own colours, symbols, house, equipment, and neighbourhood supporters. Membership gave a young man status. He belonged to a group people recognised. At parades, the engine was polished and decorated. At fires, the men demonstrated strength in front of crowds. A company that arrived first could claim the best water source and receive the credit for controlling the blaze. Rival companies sometimes fought before fighting the fire. Men blocked competing engines, seized hydrants, cut ropes, or overturned equipment. Fists, clubs, tools, and whatever happened to be lying in the street could be used. While one building burned, 2 groups of men might argue over which of them had the right to save it. Try to imagine watching this from an upstairs window. Smoke is moving along the block. Someone below is shouting that there are children inside. A fire engine approaches from one direction, followed by another from the opposite street. Instead of working together, the companies collide. Men abandon the ropes and begin striking one another. The residents need water. The firemen need victory. This seems absurd until we understand what a fire company represented. It was not merely an emergency service. It was a social club, political organisation, neighbourhood army, and source of personal identity. A man who insulted the company insulted everyone in it. A company that surrendered a hydrant might be mocked for weeks. Political leaders understood the value of these men. They could gather a crowd quickly, carry banners, distribute ballots, intimidate opponents, guard polling places, and persuade uncertain voters with an efficiency that did not always depend on words. In an age before secret ballots were standard and before elections were protected as they are today, voting could be a public, physical event. Party workers stood near the polls. Men were watched as they approached. Some voted more than once. Others discovered that expressing the wrong preference could make the walk home unpleasant. The saloon served as the office where much of this business was organised. During the 19th century, a Bowery saloon offered more than alcohol. It provided warmth, newspapers, food, information, companionship, and access to people who might help a man find work. A labourer could enter with a problem and discover that the bartender knew a contractor hiring men the next morning. An immigrant could ask which landlord was honest. A local politician could arrange a favour. A gang leader could hear who had insulted whom before the story reached the police. The owner stood behind the bar and watched everything. He knew who paid immediately and who needed credit. He knew which customer became violent after 3 drinks. He knew when a stranger was asking too many questions. He heard about jobs, arrests, debts, affairs, fights and elections. In a neighbourhood where many residents had little formal influence, The man who controlled a popular saloon could become a broker between the street and city government. A police officer might stop by for a drink. A ward politician might use the back room for meetings. A prizefighter might train nearby and attract admirers. If someone needed bail, legal assistance, or a message delivered to a powerful person, the saloon keeper often knew where to begin. This did not make every saloon a criminal headquarters. Most were ordinary businesses serving ordinary customers. Yet the privacy of a back room, the flow of cash, and the constant arrival of men made the saloon useful for activities that were better kept away from official offices. Gambling could take place behind a door. Stolen goods could be discussed without displaying them. Election plans could be made over drinks. A stranger could be studied before anyone decided whether he was a customer or a victim. The room itself was usually arranged to keep people there. A long bar occupied one side. Bottles stood on shelves behind it. A stove supplied heat in winter. Spittoons rested on the floor. Sawdust helped absorb mud, tobacco, and spilled beer. Tables filled the rear. The air smelled of smoke, liquor, wet wool, sweat, and whatever food was available. A free lunch might be offered with the purchase of a drink. The food was often salty, encouraging the customer to become thirsty again. Bread, cheese, pickled vegetables, sausage, beans, or pieces of meat could keep a man inside longer than he had planned. For a worker living in a boarding house, the saloon might be the most comfortable room he entered all day. Women did not occupy these spaces on equal terms. Some saloons excluded them. Others admitted women only in separate rooms or under circumstances that immediately affected their reputations. Female performers, servers, sex workers, and poor women seeking customers were visible in parts of the Bowery nightlife, but the ordinary saloon remained largely a male world. Men conducted business there, built political connections there, and developed public identities that women were rarely allowed to possess in the same way. Physical toughness mattered because formal protection was unreliable. Police forces were developing, but officers were limited, corruption was common, and the law could be applied differently depending on a man's political connections. A saloon keeper therefore hired bartenders, doormen, or regular customers capable of removing trouble without waiting for official assistance. A man who acquired a reputation as a fighter could turn that reputation into employment and influence. He might collect debts, protect a business, accompany a politician, or discourage competing groups from entering a certain block. The best fight was sometimes the one that did not occur. If everyone believed a man was willing to break a jaw, he could spend much of the evening sitting quietly. Prize fighting supplied the Bowery with some of its most admired figures. Bare-knuckle boxing operated under rules that allowed contests to continue for many rounds, sometimes until one fighter could no longer rise. Matches were frequently illegal and had to be arranged outside the immediate reach of authorities. Spectators travelled by boat, train, carriage, or wagon to fields where a ring could be formed before police received reliable information. These fights were not elegant exchanges performed beneath bright arena lights. A contest could last for hours. Fighters struck with bare fists grappled, threw one another, and rested briefly between rounds. A round ended when a man fell. He then had limited time to return to the centre. Broken noses, damaged hands, cuts, swelling, and exhaustion were expected. Gouging, biting, and other acts might occur despite whatever rules had been agreed upon. Prize fighters became public heroes because their victories represented more than sport. They could stand for neighbourhoods, ethnic groups, political parties, and ideas about masculinity. Betting added further intensity. Men who had never met either fighter placed wagers on the result and spoke afterward as though they had personally contributed to every punch. William Poole was one of the most feared men connected with this world. Known as Bill the Butcher because of his trade, he was large, physically powerful, associated with volunteer firemen, nativist politics, and the Bowery Boys. He operated among men who admired fighting ability and believed political disputes could be decided through intimidation. Poole was not a theatrical invention, although later stories enlarged him. He was a real butcher, saloon keeper, political enforcer, and pugilist, whose personal rivalry with Irish-born boxer John Morrissey became tied to the larger struggle between nativists and Tammany Hall. Morrissey represented a different route to power. Born in Ireland and raised in New York State, he entered bare-knuckle prize-fighting, gambling, and democratic politics. He had the support of men connected with Tammany Hall and the Irish immigrant community. His nickname, Old Smoke, reportedly came from an incident in which burning coals scorched his back during a fight, yet failed to stop him. Poole and Morrissey did not simply dislike one another as athletes. Each represented political and ethnic loyalties that made compromise nearly impossible. Morrissey's supporters saw Poole as a nativist thug who terrorised Irish voters. Poole's allies saw Morrissey as part of an immigrant political machine taking control of the city. In 1854, the two men fought in a brutal encounter near the Hudson River. It was not a regulated sporting contest with neutral officials and medical staff. Poole gained the advantage, using wrestling, striking, and the rough methods common to street fighting. Morrissey was defeated and humiliated, but the rivalry did not end. Several months later, on the night of February 24th, 1855, Poole entered Stannock's Hall, a drinking establishment on Broadway. Morrissey had been there earlier, and men connected with him remained in the room. An argument developed. Weapons appeared. Poole was shot and wounded badly. He survived for nearly 2 weeks. Newspapers followed his condition. Supporters visited. When he died on March 8th at the age of 33, he was transformed from a feared street figure into a political martyr by the nativist movement. Contemporary reporting described the death and the public attention surrounding it, while later accounts repeated the words he was said to have spoken near the end, declaring himself an American. His funeral became a public demonstration. Thousands joined or watched the procession. Fire companies, political groups, friends, admirers, and curious spectators filled the streets. The size of the crowd showed how closely violence, celebrity, and politics had become connected in New York. A man known for fighting and intimidation received the kind of funeral usually associated with a major public leader. Morrissey continued rising. He became a gambling operator, political figure, and eventually a member of the United States Congress. His career sounds unlikely only if we imagine boxing, gambling, gangs, and politics as separate professions. In mid-19th century New York, the same man could move through all four because each required money, loyalty, personal courage, and an ability to organise other men. Morrissey later served in state politics and challenged parts of the same Tammany system that had helped him advance. Poole's death did not end street violence. On July 4th, 1857, conflict between Bowery groups and men associated with 5 Points erupted into one of the largest gang disturbances New York had yet seen. The city's police were already divided by a political struggle. Mayor Fernando Wood supported the older municipal police, while the state had established a new metropolitan force. For a time, rival police organisations claimed authority in the same city. The confusion gave street groups more freedom to act. The fighting began near buildings at 40 and 42 Bowery, associated with the Atlantic Guards and Bowery Boys. Men connected with the Dead Rabbits and other 5 Points groups attacked with clubs, stones, brickbats, knives and firearms. The Bowery men responded. The struggle spread into nearby streets and continued over 2 days. Estimates of the number involved and killed vary, but hundreds participated, while other people used the disorder as an opportunity to loot. Police and militia forces eventually restored control. Imagine the Bowery during those hours. Holiday crowds have gathered. Firecrackers are already exploding, making it difficult to distinguish celebration from gunfire. A group runs past carrying clubs. Shopkeepers pull shutters across windows. Residents look down from upper floors and then move away from the glass when stones begin flying. Men who are not present at the first fight arrive because friends have called them. or because a rumour claims that their neighbourhood is under attack. The street becomes divided into lines that keep moving. Bowery groups push toward 5 Points. Irish gangs force them back. Police enter and are struck by men from both sides. Someone fires from a window. Someone else drags an injured friend into a doorway. Looters break into shops behind the fighting, taking whatever can be carried before the owner returns. Most of the participants do not know what is happening several blocks away. They understand only the section of street directly in front of them. Orders are shouted but cannot be heard. Rumours travel quickly and inaccurately. A dead man is reported when no one has died. Another death occurs and is not reported at all. When the fighting ends, the Bowery does not look conquered by either side. It looks damaged. Windows are broken. Stones cover the pavement. Blood marks entrances. Families search for missing men. Newspapers begin turning the violence into a story with heroes, villains, and clear sides, although the people who lived through it may not agree on how it began. The famous gangs of this period have often been romanticised because their names, clothing, and rivalries fit easily into dramatic stories. Yet most violence was not glamorous. It left labourers unable to work, families without wages, and residents trapped inside rooms while men fought outside. A gang could provide protection and belonging, but it could also demand loyalty at the worst possible moment. The Civil War draft riots of 1863 exposed the same mixture of politics, ethnicity, poverty, and organised street violence on a much larger scale. Working-class anger over conscription, especially the provision allowing wealthier men to avoid service by paying a fee or hiring substitutes, turned into days of rioting. Black New Yorkers were attacked with extraordinary cruelty. Homes, businesses, and institutions were destroyed. Members of neighbourhood gangs and fire companies participated alongside workers and other residents. The Bowery and nearby districts again became routes through which crowds moved, gathered, and fought. By the late 19th century, the old Bowery boys had disappeared as a distinct force. The volunteer fire department had been replaced by a professional service after the Civil War. Immigration altered neighbourhood alliances. New criminal organisations emerged with different ethnic bases and more organised methods. The street fighter tied to a fire company gave way gradually to racketeers who controlled gambling, prostitution, theft, and political work through larger networks. The saloon remained. It continued serving as office, clubhouse, hiring hall, refuge, and informal court. A local figure could sit at the same table every evening and receive visitors one at a time. A bartender carried messages. A policeman entered through the front door and left without noticing the gambling room at the rear. A politician provided assistance to a family facing eviction and expected gratitude at the next election. Authority on the Bowery was rarely announced. It could be seen in small acts. One man entered and received a drink without ordering. Another was given the best chair. A stranger was told to leave after asking the wrong question. A debt was forgiven because someone powerful had spoken. A fight ended when an older man placed one hand on a younger man's shoulder. The sidewalk had rules as well. Men gathered outside familiar saloons, creating narrow passages through which everyone else had to move. A resident knew which group occupied which corner. A newcomer did not. Walking confidently mattered, but too much confidence could be interpreted as a challenge. Looking down appeared weak. Staring appeared disrespectful. The safest expression suggested that you had business on the street and no interest in anyone else's. Police officers learned similar calculations. An arrest that looked simple from a distance could bring 20 men out of a doorway. A patrolman assigned to the Bowery needed physical courage, but he also needed judgment. Some men could be arrested without consequence. Others had political protectors. Removing a popular saloon-keeper might create more disorder than ignoring the offence that had brought the officer there. By the 1880s and 1890s, new gang figures were emerging around the Lower East Side. Their operations were more openly tied to protection rackets, gambling rooms, brothels, theft, and paid violence. Political machines still use tough men to influence elections, control meetings, and discourage opposition. The names changed, but the arrangement remained familiar. The street provided manpower. The saloon provided headquarters, and politics provided protection. Night after night, these men occupied the bright end of the Bowery. They stood beneath theatre signs, entered saloons without paying, attended prize fights, and allowed newspapers to enlarge their reputations. Yet only a few steps away, another population was becoming more visible. These were men who ruled no corner, commanded no fire company, and frightened no politician. They carried everything they owned in a bundle, or kept it in the pocket of a worn coat. As the saloons closed and the powerful men went home, those without power began looking for a different kind of doorway. Some had enough money for a bed. Others could afford only a chair, a hammock, or a section of floor. The Bowery that had provided entertainment and influence to working men was also becoming the place where New York sent the men it no longer knew what to do with. The Bowery that had provided entertainment and influence to working men was also becoming the place where New York sent the men it no longer knew what to do with. They did not arrive as a single group, and they did not all share the same story. Some came carrying tools and expected to find employment within a few days. Others had spent years moving between seasonal jobs, rented rooms, hospitals, jails, and sidewalks. A few had families somewhere else. Some had no one waiting for them at all. By the end of the 19th century, thousands of these men were passing through the cheap lodging houses clustered along the Bowery, and every evening began with the same practical question: how much sleep could they afford? Let us stand near Chatham Square on a cold night around 1890. The elevated trains are running overhead, making the Eastern structure tremble as steam and smoke collect beneath it. The Bowery is still bright with saloons and theatres, but another kind of business is preparing for its busiest hours. Narrow signs announce rooms, beds, lodging and accommodation. The language sounds respectable. The buildings often are not. A man approaches one of the doorways with his coat buttoned high around his neck. Everything he owns is either on his body or wrapped inside a small bundle. He has spent much of the day looking for work. Perhaps he visited a construction site and arrived after all the labourers had been hired. Perhaps he waited near a freight yard where foremen chose the strongest-looking men from a crowd. Perhaps he found several hours of unloading work, but not enough to guarantee another shift tomorrow. He stops outside the lodging house and counts the coins in his hand. The calculation is simple, but the consequences are not. He can pay more for something resembling a private room, spend less for a hammock, or keep enough money for food by accepting a place on the floor. The Bowery offered accommodation at nearly every level of desperation. By 1890, more than 9,000 homeless men were estimated to be finding nightly lodging along the street. At the better end, 25 cents could purchase a small room with clean sheets. 7 cents bought a hammock in a dark, windowless sub-basement. 5 cents secured little more than a place to lie on a wooden floor. This was not how lodging on the Bowery had begun. During the middle of the 19th century, boarding houses were common and did not automatically carry disgrace. Young unmarried workers arriving in New York often rented rooms in the lower wards, because those neighbourhoods placed them near workshops, markets, warehouses, and trades. A respectable boarding house could provide a bed, meals, companionship, and an introduction to the city. The young men living there helped create the audience for the Bowery's theatres, beer halls, restaurants, and saloons. They worked during the day and spent part of their wages along the same street at night. The difference between a boarder and a homeless lodger could be thinner than anyone wanted to admit. A boarder paid regularly and often ate with the household. A lodger paid by the night and had no assurance that the same space would be available tomorrow. One man possessed a room. The other possessed several hours indoors. A lost job could move someone from one category to the other quickly. New York's economy offered work, but much of that work was unstable. Building slowed during winter, Shipping rose and fell. Factories dismissed workers when orders declined. Economic panics closed businesses with little warning. An injury that would now lead to medical treatment and protected leave could simply end a labourer's usefulness. If he could not lift, carry, climb or stand for 10 hours, another man waited outside who could. There was no broad unemployment insurance, no guaranteed income, and no dependable public shelter system waiting to catch him. Savings disappeared into rent and food. A family might help for a while, assuming he had one nearby and pride allowed him to ask. A church or mutual aid society might provide assistance, particularly if he belonged to an established ethnic or occupational community. Men without those connections could fall through the city rapidly. One week, a worker rented a bed in a decent boarding house. The following week he moved to a cheaper room. After that came the lodging house, then the police station floor, a hallway, a freight yard, or the street. Nothing about the change required a dramatic decision. Poverty often advanced through small payments that could no longer be made. The man outside the Bowery lodging house chooses the 5-cent floor because he has not eaten since morning. He passes through a doorway into a room where someone sits behind a desk or counter collecting coins. The owner does not need to know his history. There is no lease, no reference, and no expectation that he will remain. He pays for the night and becomes one more body in a business built around fitting as many bodies as possible beneath one roof. At the 25-cent level, a lodger might receive a narrow compartment formed by wooden partitions. The walls did not always reach the ceiling, and privacy was largely visual. He could hear coughing, snoring, arguments, footsteps, and every movement made in the neighbouring spaces. There might be a cot, a thin mattress, a hook for clothing, and enough room to turn around if the door was closed carefully. It was not comfortable, but it offered a small boundary between one person and everyone else. Farther down the price scale, the boundary disappeared. Rows of beds or bunks occupied a common room. Hammocks could be stretched close together in basements where ventilation was poor and sunlight never entered. Floors were divided informally according to the space required by a human body. A man placed his bundle beneath his head, wrapped his coat around himself, and hoped he still possessed both when morning came. The room smelled of wet clothing, tobacco, unwashed bodies, cheap disinfectant, old wood, and the air produced by too many men breathing in a closed space. Windows, when they existed, might remain shut during winter because the lodgers feared the cold more immediately than stale air. In summer, the same rooms became hot enough that men slept outside when police permitted it. Bedbugs and lice did not distinguish between the man who had been poor for 10 years and the man who had arrived that afternoon. Disease moved easily through shared air, shared bedding, and limited washing facilities. A cough passed from one bunk to the next. A fever could spread before anyone understood what it was. The lodger who became sick faced another calculation. Rest might help him recover, but rest also prevented him from earning the price of another night. Theft was common enough that experienced lodgers developed routines. Shoes could be placed beneath the head or tied to a wrist. Coins were hidden inside clothing. A coat might serve simultaneously as blanket, pillow, luggage, and the most valuable object a man owned. Removing it carelessly could mean waking cold and unable to leave without exposing whatever remained beneath it. Yet the greatest danger was not always another lodger. It was exhaustion. A man who had walked for hours, eaten poorly, and worked whenever anyone offered him labour could fall asleep almost anywhere. He became less careful with his possessions. He failed to notice illness developing. He missed the early morning hiring line. One lost day created another night without money, and the Bowery was filled with businesses prepared to sell short relief from that anxiety. Alcohol offered warmth, confidence, and several hours in which failure seemed less immediate. Saloons sometimes provided food with a drink which made them attractive to men who needed both. For someone sleeping in a crowded room or outdoors, remaining in a warm saloon until closing could feel practical. The difficulty came when the money reserved for lodging disappeared across the bar. Newspapers and reformers often described these men as though drunkenness had created every other problem in their lives. Alcohol did destroy health, wages, and families. It also became the explanation respectable observers preferred, because it made poverty appear to be a personal decision. A man who drank away his bed money could be blamed. A city whose wages, housing, and employment practices kept thousands near homelessness required more uncomfortable questions. The language used for the poor reflected this judgment. Charitable organisations divided people into categories such as deserving and undeserving. A widow with children might be treated as deserving because her hardship appeared involuntary. An able-bodied man without work was viewed with suspicion. Why was he not employed? Why had his family abandoned him? Why did he appear drunk? Why had he moved from place to place? The questions were not always unreasonable, but they were usually asked by people who knew they would sleep indoors that night. The men themselves included far more variety than the label suggested. There were immigrants who had not yet found relatives or countrymen willing to help. There were veterans carrying injuries that made steady work difficult. There were older labourers whose strength had declined before their need to eat had declined with it. There were men suffering from mental illness at a time when treatment was limited and institutional care could be brutal. There were husbands who had left homes after arguments and fathers too ashamed to return without wages. There were thieves, confidence men, and professional beggars as well. Cheap lodging houses gave them access to vulnerable men and places where stolen objects could change hands. Jacob Riis, the journalist and reformer who documented New York's tenements and lodging houses, regarded many of these establishments as places where poverty and criminal activity reinforced one another. In his 1890 book, he described the Bowery and Chatham Street houses as sheltering a nightly population comparable to a sizable town. His language was often severe and sometimes reduced residents to stereotypes, but the overcrowding he described was real. Riis understood part of this world because he had once been close to it. He arrived from Denmark in 1870, struggled to find steady work, and experienced severe poverty before becoming a police reporter. Later, armed with a camera and the new ability to photograph dark interiors using flash powder, he entered rooms that most middle-class New Yorkers never saw. His photographs showed men lying close together in unauthorized 5-cent lodging spaces, their possessions arranged around them because there was nowhere else to put anything. One of his best-known images, made around 1890 in a Bayard Street tenement near the Bowery, recorded several lodgers crowded into a room where each had paid 5 cents for a place. Imagine being one of those men when Riis enters. You're asleep, or trying to sleep in a room filled with strangers. The door opens. Several visitors appear with equipment. Someone prepares flash powder. There is a sudden burst of light, bright enough to expose the room for a fraction of a second. Smoke follows. You have been turned into evidence before you have fully awakened. The photograph will be shown to audiences who study the bedding, walls, clothing, and faces. Some viewers will feel sympathy. Others will see proof that the poor are dirty, dangerous, or incapable of managing their lives. The man in the image will probably never know where the photograph travelled. That tension followed reform throughout the Bowery. Exposing suffering could bring assistance and new laws. It could also transform real people into a spectacle for those who wished to visit poverty without sharing it. Men who could not afford even 5 cents sometimes went to police stations. Station house lodging rooms provided free shelter, but they were overcrowded and unhealthy. Riis repeatedly attacked the system, arguing that rooms intended as emergency refuge had become sources of disease and environments in which vulnerable people mixed with experienced criminals. Reports connected the station lodgings with outbreaks of typhus, and the city eventually closed them in 1896. A police lodging room carried its own humiliation. A man entered a station and admitted that he had nowhere else to sleep. He waited beneath the eyes of officers who might regard him as unfortunate, dishonest, troublesome, or all three. He could be searched, questioned, and placed in a crowded room with others seeking shelter. The difference between receiving protection and being detained was not always obvious. Outside, sleeping carried the risk of arrest for vagrancy or disorder. A doorway belonged to the property owner. A park bench attracted police attention. Railroad yards and warehouses were dangerous and guarded. The city expected a man to disappear at night while providing very few legal places in which he could do so. This gap between the lodging house and the police station gave rescue missions their opportunity. In 1872, Jeremiah Macaulay established the Gospel Rescue Mission on the Lower East Side. Macaulay had known crime, prison, and alcoholism before undergoing a religious conversion, and his work was directed toward people respectable churches often avoided. The mission movement assumed that poverty involved spiritual as well as material collapse. Its workers offered preaching, prayer, food, and personal attention to people who might otherwise receive only arrest or contempt. The Bowery mission followed in 1879, founded by the Reverend and Mrs. Albert Gleason Rulifson to serve indigent homeless men. It began with prayer services in a small room at 14 Bowery, and moved repeatedly as its work expanded. Step inside one of those early meetings. The room is not grand. Chairs or benches face a small platform. The men entering carry the smell of the street and lodging houses with them. Some have come sincerely seeking help. Some want warmth. Some have heard that food may be provided. Others enter because there is nowhere better to sit. A hymn begins. Several men know the words from childhood, though they have not entered a church for years. One sings quietly. Another does not sing at all. A third sleeps with his chin against his chest until someone touches his shoulder. The preacher speaks about sin, repentance, and the possibility of beginning again. He may describe alcohol as the chain holding the men to the Bowery. For some listeners, this is accurate. For others, alcohol is only one part of a much larger failure involving injury, unemployment, illness, grief, and isolation. The mission's message could be demanding. Help was often tied to expectations about behaviour, sobriety, and religion. A man who disliked being preached to might endure the service because he needed food. Another might welcome the structure because no one had spoken to him as though change were possible in a long time. The important detail is that someone knew he was present. In the lodging house, he was a payment and a body-occupying space. At the police station, he was a potential problem. At the mission, however imperfectly, he could be addressed by name. Sarah J. Bird became one of the most important figures in the Bowery Mission's early history. Known as the Mother of the Bowery Mission, she worked there from 1881 until 1914. She had already participated in Christian rescue work before making the Bowery a central part of her life. Without extensive staff or institutional support during the mission's difficult early years, she conducted regular prayer services and remained a consistent presence among men who much of New York preferred not to see. Picture her facing a room filled with men larger than she is, some sober, some not, some amused that a respectable woman has chosen to speak to them. She cannot solve unemployment that evening. She cannot provide private rooms for everyone. She cannot repair old injuries or reunite every family. What she can do is return the following week. That regularity mattered. Many men on the Bowery had become accustomed to people making one attempt and leaving. Employers dismissed them. Families stopped answering letters. Police officers moved them from one block to another. Charitable visitors sometimes arrived in groups, expressed horror, and returned to comfortable homes. A person who appeared repeatedly became harder to dismiss as merely curious. The mission itself struggled financially and moved through several addresses. It operated at 36 Bowery during the 1880s, relocated to 105 Bowery in 1887, and moved again after a fire. Dr. Lewis Klotch, publisher of the Christian Herald, purchased the organisation in 1895 when it faced possible closure. That same year, food service became part of the mission's outreach, offering a substantial meal for a small payment. The work later expanded to include employment assistance, and by the opening years of the 20th century, the organisation was helping large numbers of men search for jobs. Employment assistance addressed something a sermon alone could not. A man needed more than a promise that his life could improve. He needed an employer willing to test that promise. Mission workers contacted businesses and attempted to place men in available positions. The arrangement could fail. A man might leave after one day. An employer might exploit workers who had little bargaining power. Illness or addiction could interfere. Yet a single successful placement could move someone from a floor to a bed, from a bed to a boarding house, and from a boarding house into a rented room. That journey was rarely described in newspapers because recovery did not attract the attention given to collapse. A man who disappeared from the Bowery by finding work simply became another worker somewhere else. In 1902, the Bowery Mission began the bread line for which it would become famous. During the cold months, breakfast was served at 1 o'clock in the morning to homeless men waiting outside. The timing tells us how long the night could feel when a person had nowhere to go. 1 o'clock was not breakfast by the ordinary clock. It was a warm interruption in the most difficult hours between the closing of the saloons and the opening of the hiring places. Imagine the line beneath the elevated railway. Men stand close together, not because they know one another, but because the air is cold. Some keep their hands inside coat sleeves. Others stamp their feet against the pavement. A train passes overhead, sending noise through the iron columns and making conversation impossible for several seconds. No one in line wants to appear desperate, although desperation is the only reason to wait outdoors at 1 in the morning for bread and coffee. A man studies the person in front of him instead of looking toward the doorway. Another keeps his face lowered because he wants work nearby and fears being recognised. A third speaks easily with everyone because he has used the line many times and no longer spends energy pretending otherwise. When the doors open, the line moves. The meal is simple. Its importance lies in temperature, quantity, and certainty. The men know food is available. For a short period they are indoors. Their hands become warm enough to move normally. Someone pours coffee, someone places bread before them. The room is crowded, but it is not the lodging house floor. Missions did not remove homelessness from the Bowery. They could not keep pace with the number of people arriving, losing work, aging, becoming ill, or struggling with alcohol. They also brought moral judgments of their own, and some reformers spoke about residents as though the street had erased their individuality. Still, food remained food. A bed remained a bed. Assistance finding work could matter more than the language surrounding it. The cheap lodging houses and missions existed beside one another because each answered a different question. The lodging house keeper asked whether a man could pay. The mission worker asked whether he could be changed. The man himself was usually asking something more immediate. Where can I stay until morning? By then, the Bowery's homeless population had become part of the street's public identity. Cartoonists, reporters, tourists, photographers, missionaries, police officials and politicians all claimed to understand the men standing beneath the elevated tracks. Some called them victims. Others called them criminals, drunkards, tramps, failures, or evidence that the city had lost control. Jacob Rees and other investigators brought cameras, notebooks and reform campaigns into rooms landlords had preferred to keep unseen. Housing laws had begun regulating lodging and tenement conditions in 1867, with further revisions in 1879 and 1901. Inspectors gained new authority, police station shelters were closed, and demands for sanitation, ventilation, fire safety and oversight became harder for city officials to ignore. The question was no longer whether the Bowery had a problem. Nearly everyone agreed that it did. The argument concerned what kind of problem it was. To the mission, it was a crisis of bodies and souls. To the police, it was a matter of crime and public order. To landlords, it was a profitable housing market serving customers who could afford nothing better. To reformers, it was proof that the city had permitted dangerous conditions to grow behind closed doors. To business owners trying to improve the street's reputation, the men themselves were becoming an obstacle that needed to be removed. Soon the inspectors would arrive more frequently. Reporters would publish the worst details they could find. Police commissioners would announce campaigns against vice and vagrancy. Wealthy New Yorkers would tour the district under the protection of guides, then return home convinced that they had seen the Bowery's entire truth in a single evening. The lodging house doors would remain open, but the people entering them were about to become the central evidence in a long effort to clean up New York's most notorious street, and no one had yet decided whether cleaning the Bowery meant improving their lives or simply forcing them to disappear somewhere else. The argument over the Bowery was no longer about whether the street contained poverty, crime, and exploitation. By the final years of the 19th century, too many people had seen the overcrowded lodging rooms, illegal gambling houses, brothels, saloons, and back rooms where stolen goods could be exchanged. The disagreement concerned who was responsible and what should be done. Some reformers believed the answer was better housing, public parks, honest policing, and practical assistance for people without work. Others wanted stronger laws, more arrests, and fewer places where poor people could gather. Property owners wanted customers who spent more money. Religious organisations wanted souls rescued. Politicians wanted the Bowery quiet enough to avoid scandal without losing the votes and payments that came from the same establishments everyone publicly condemned. Cleaning up the street could mean many things. It could mean removing a dishonest police captain. It could mean closing a dangerous lodging house. It could mean forcing a saloon keeper to stop selling alcohol on Sunday. It could also mean arresting a homeless man because someone had decided that the sight of him was damaging business. To understand why reform became so difficult, let us enter a Bowery saloon in the early 1890s. It is late evening, and the room is crowded. The long bar is lined with customers who have come from workshops, theatres, lodging houses, and nearby tenements. Smoke hangs in the air. A bartender moves quickly between bottles while keeping one eye on a disagreement near the rear wall. At a table beyond the stove, several men are gambling. Upstairs, rooms are being rented for purposes the owner will deny if an inspector asks. A police officer enters. No one becomes silent. No one runs toward the rear door. The bartender places a glass before the officer, and the conversation continues. The reason is simple. The officer has not necessarily come to close the establishment. He may have come to collect information, accept a payment, receive a free drink, speak with a political worker, or remind the owner that the price of protection has changed. The law and the businesses violating it are not always enemies. Sometimes they are partners negotiating the division of income. Police corruption was not an occasional weakness in late 19th century New York. It had become part of the system through which gambling houses, brothels, saloons, and other illegal businesses operated. Officers and precinct commanders could demand payments in exchange for allowing violations to continue. A business that refused might suddenly receive repeated inspections. One that paid could operate almost openly. Promotion within the police department itself was frequently tied to political influence and money, encouraging officers who purchased positions to recover the cost from the neighbourhoods they controlled. The 1894 to 1895 Lexo investigation would eventually expose corruption involving bribery, extortion, election fraud, brutality, and police protection of vice on a scale that shocked even New Yorkers accustomed to municipal scandal. For a Bowery saloon keeper, the arrangement was simply another business expense. He paid the brewer, the landlord, the bartender, the suppliers, and the police. If he operated gambling or allowed prostitution, the payment rose. He did not describe this as corruption when speaking privately. He described it as keeping the doors open. The officer finished his drink, said something quietly to the bartender, and returned to the sidewalk. Nothing visible had happened. That was precisely how the arrangement survived. One of the men who decided to challenge it was Reverend Charles Henry Parkhurst, the minister of Madison Square Presbyterian Church. Parkhurst did not live on the Bowery, and he did not resemble the men who normally controlled its saloons. He was a clergyman addressing a prosperous congregation, a man whose authority came from a pulpit rather than a ward clubhouse. In February 1892, he delivered a sermon accusing Tammany Hall and the municipal government of protecting gambling, prostitution, and other forms of vice. City officials responded by demanding evidence. They expected that a minister would repeat rumours, retreat under pressure, and return to preaching about safer subjects. Parkhurst chose another method. With the assistance of a private detective and companions, he entered the nightlife he had condemned. He wore rough clothing, visited saloons, gambling rooms, brothels and dance halls, and observed activities that respectable men usually denied knowing anything about. His excursions were awkward because he was not skilled at appearing disreputable. A Bowery bartender could usually recognise a man who had purchased old clothing specifically to look poor. Yet Parkhurst saw enough to support his accusations, and he returned with witnesses and detailed information, rather than general moral outrage. His campaign helped create the pressure that produced the Lexo Committee, the state investigation that began taking testimony in 1894. Imagine the reaction inside the Bowery's protected establishments when the story became public. A minister had entered their rooms, watched their routines, and carried the details back uptown. Owners wondered which employees had spoken to him. Police officers wondered which payments could be proven. Politicians wondered whether public anger would last until the election. Most investigations in New York produced headlines, several resignations, and a gradual return to the old arrangements. The Lexo hearings became more dangerous because witnesses described the machinery in detail. Testimony accumulated into more than 10,000 pages. Police officials were questioned about the purchase of promotions, regular collections from illegal businesses, political interference, and the protection of prostitution and gambling. One captain testified that obtaining his rank had cost $15,000, an enormous sum for a public employee. Men did not pay that amount merely for the honour of wearing a different badge. They expected the position to produce income. The hearings allowed middle-class New Yorkers to hear what Bowery residents already understood. The police could enforce the law very firmly against a homeless man sleeping in a doorway, and very gently against a profitable establishment making regular payments. Public order was not simply purchased by the city through taxes, it was sold privately, block by block. The scandal helped defeat Tammany Hall in the 1894 election, and brought William L. Strong into the mayor's office as the candidate of a reform coalition. Theodore Roosevelt joined the city's police commission in 1895 and became its most energetic member. Roosevelt and Jacob Riis formed an unusual partnership. Roosevelt came from a wealthy New York family and possessed political ambition, confidence, and a strong belief in discipline. Riis had experienced poverty as a young immigrant and spent years reporting from the city's police headquarters. The two men travelled through poor districts at night, appearing at police posts without warning to determine whether officers were performing their duties. Riis later remembered Roosevelt as the public official who had finally been willing to act on conditions other men merely discussed. A patrolman asleep or absent from his assigned corner could no longer assume that no superior would notice. Roosevelt pushed for examinations, firearms training, enforcement of rules, and a reduction in political control over appointments. He also attempted strict enforcement of Sunday closing laws against saloons. This last campaign revealed the limits of reform very quickly. To Roosevelt, a law that prohibited Sunday alcohol sales had to be enforced. Selective enforcement was the foundation of corruption. If the police could decide which saloon remained open, then the saloon keeper had a reason to pay them. Close every saloon, and the bribe lost its value. The logic was clear. The social reality was not. For thousands of working men, Sunday was the only full day away from the factory, shop, stable, dock, or construction site. Many lived in crowded apartments or boarding rooms where leisure was nearly impossible. The saloon provided chairs, warmth, newspapers, food, music, and companionship. German immigrant families had traditions of Sunday beer drinking that did not carry the same meaning reformers attached to the American saloon. Irish workers often regarded the neighbourhood drinking place as a social and political centre. Closing these establishments on the one-day labourers were free felt less like moral improvement and more like one class telling another how it was permitted to rest. The doors closed officially. Behind some of them, business continued through side entrances, back rooms, shutters, and arrangements with officers who had not become honest, merely because a commissioner ordered them to be honest. Other saloons followed the law and lost income. Customers blamed Roosevelt. Reform had reduced one opportunity for corruption, while convincing many working-class residents that reformers cared more about Sunday beer than exhausting labour, high rent, or unsafe housing. Rees's campaign against police lodging houses achieved a more lasting result. He had written repeatedly about the filthy, overcrowded rooms in which homeless men and women slept at police stations. He saw them as sources of disease, and places where young or inexperienced people could be victimised or recruited by criminals. His opposition was also deeply personal. During his own period of homelessness, a valuable locket had been stolen while he slept in a police lodging room. When he complained, he was expelled, and his dog was killed by a policeman. Rees never forgot the humiliation. With Roosevelt's support, the police lodging houses were finally closed in 1896, with the expectation that better charitable and municipal services would replace them. Closing a dangerous room was easier than creating enough decent beds. Some homeless people found help in missions and charitable shelters. Others moved into the private lodging houses already crowded along the Bowery. A reformer could point to the closure as progress. A man still looking for 5 cents at midnight might experience the change differently. Rees continued using articles, books, photographs, and public lectures to expose conditions in tenements and cheap lodgings. His flash photographs allowed audiences to see dark interiors that ordinary cameras could not record. He showed men sleeping on floors, families working in crowded rooms, children living near garbage, and residents packed into buildings with little ventilation or sanitation. The images helped persuade people who had ignored written descriptions. They also placed vulnerable residents under the gaze of strangers, sometimes without permission, and often through language shaped by Rees's ethnic and moral prejudices. He could be compassionate toward hard-working families and unforgiving toward people he classified as idle tramps. His reform vision combined real sympathy, harsh judgment, practical action, and the paternal beliefs common among progressive reformers. The housing campaigns produced investigations and laws that reached beyond the Bowery. The Tenement House Committee, created in 1894, examined overcrowded and unsanitary buildings. Reformers attacked rear tenements, dark interior rooms, inadequate toilets, dangerous stairs, and the narrow air shafts that had been offered as solutions under earlier regulations, but often became channels for garbage, smoke, noise, and disease. The Tenement House Act of 1901 imposed stronger requirements concerning light, ventilation, sanitation, fire safety, and interior facilities in new buildings. It did not transform every existing structure overnight, but it established that landlords could not treat the interior conditions of crowded housing as entirely private matters. The same reform impulse created parks and playgrounds. Rees argued that children required safe outdoor space, and that streets, alleys, and dark hallways encouraged crime because the city had provided no alternative. His long campaign helped replace the dense housing of Mulberry Bend, just west of the lower Bowery, with a public park. Similar efforts supported playgrounds on Rivington Street and elsewhere in poor districts. Buildings were demolished, light reached the ground, and children received places where playing did not require dodging wagons or police officers. Yet demolition carried its own question. Where did the displaced residents go? Reformers photographed the structures before they came down, celebrated the removal of a notorious block, and opened a park. The families who had rented those rooms still needed housing they could afford. Some moved into nearby tenements, increasing crowding elsewhere. The city had improved one location without eliminating the poverty that had filled it. Liquor regulation produced another example of a reform creating an unexpected business opportunity. In 1896, New York State passed the Raines Law, which increased licensing costs and attempted to restrict Sunday liquor sales. Hotels serving meals to guests received an exemption. Saloons soon discovered that they could qualify as hotels by adding bedrooms, sometimes the minimum number required, whether or not anyone genuinely intended to use them for ordinary lodging. The so-called Rains Law Hotel became one of the most notorious institutions in the vice districts. A saloon could continue selling alcohol on Sunday, while the upstairs rooms provided space for prostitution and brief private encounters. Some rooms contained little furniture and were not designed for overnight travellers. A law intended to control drinking had encouraged saloon owners to add bedrooms and enter another profitable business. Walk past one of these establishments on a Sunday evening. The front room appears to operate as a hotel dining area. A sandwich may be placed before the customer because food is required, though he has not come to eat it. Couples move toward the staircase. A clerk records names that may not be real. A police officer understands the arrangement and must decide whether the owner is protected. Reform organisations began sending investigators into these buildings. The Committee of 15 examined prostitution and vice around the turn of the century. In 1905, the Committee of 14 formed with the specific goal of eliminating Rains Law hotels. Its members included ministers, lawyers, businessmen, and civic reformers who believed temporary campaigns were not enough. They wanted a permanent organisation able to collect evidence, oppose liquor licences, pressure property owners, contact brewers and bonding companies, and force police and excise officials to act. The committee's investigators entered saloons, hotels, dance halls, restaurants, massage parlours, theatres, and tenement buildings while posing as customers. They recorded conversations, prices, sexual behaviour, drinking, gambling, and the appearance of employees and patrons. Establishments judged disorderly could be placed on a protest list, making it harder for owners to renew licences or obtain financial backing. By 1911, most of the Rains Law hotels had closed, and the committee expanded its work against prostitution and other forms of commercialised vice. This was organised reform conducted with files, reports, cards, statistics, and repeated inspections. It was more systematic than Parkhurst nights in borrowed clothing. It was also a form of surveillance focused heavily on poor and working-class leisure, particularly the behaviour of women. A young woman in a dance hall could be interpreted in several ways. She might be a factory worker spending an evening with friends. She might be employed by the hall to encourage customers to buy drinks. She might be looking for a husband, a customer, warmth, or amusement. An investigator recorded what he believed he saw, and that record could determine whether the establishment remained open. Reformers often viewed unchaperoned women, mixed dancing, and sexual independence as steps toward prostitution, even when the women themselves did not accept that interpretation. The campaigns reduced some forms of exploitation. They also narrowed the public spaces available to people whose conduct offended middle-class standards. A wealthy couple could drink, dance, and arrange a private hotel room without appearing in a vice report. A poor woman doing something similar on the Bowery could become evidence of moral collapse. Business owners increasingly joined the demand for change, though their motives were different. They did not necessarily object to every drink or performance. They objected to the Bowery's reputation driving away profitable commerce. Banks, wholesalers, manufacturers, and established merchants wanted the street associated with trade, rather than cheap amusements and homelessness. In March 1916, local interests formed the Bowery Board of Trade and Bowery Association. Their members sought to remove cheap lodging houses and low-priced entertainment venues, and even proposed changing the street's name to Central Broadway. The suggestion revealed how powerful the old name had become. A building could be repaired, a saloon could be closed. The word Bowery still caused outsiders to imagine gangs, drunkenness, prostitution, and failure. Renaming the street seemed easier than persuading New York to forget. The proposal failed. People who agreed on little else agreed that Central Broadway sounded like an address invented by a committee. New conditions changed the Bowery more effectively than a new name. The elevated railway was reconstructed along the avenue in 1916, reinforcing the dark iron canopy above the roadway. The structure discouraged major redevelopment for decades. Trains brought passengers, but the noise, smoke and reduced daylight made the street less attractive for expensive offices or residences. Low rents allowed lodging houses, small manufacturers, theatres, missions, second-hand dealers and specialty shops to remain. The Bowery developed concentrations of restaurant equipment sellers and lighting fixture businesses that could use deep, inexpensive storefronts and serve commercial customers without needing a fashionable address. Prohibition arrived nationally in 1920 and officially removed the legal saloon from the street. Reformers who had spent decades blaming alcohol for poverty and disorder could finally see what happened when the bars were closed. The result was not a sober Bowery. Some saloons became lunchrooms, shops or other legal businesses. Others reopened as speakeasies supplied by bootleggers. The trade moved behind locked doors, passwords, bribed officers, and criminal distribution networks. Prohibition reduced the visibility of legal drinking while increasing the value of illegal alcohol. Men who had once purchased beer from licensed saloon keepers now bought stronger liquor from establishments connected to organised crime. Old entertainment venues struggled. Audiences had new options, including motion picture theatres in other districts. Immigrant communities moved northward and into the outer boroughs. The German population that had supported great beer halls had already been dispersed by changes in housing, employment, and the aftermath of the 1904 General Slocum disaster. Yiddish theatre shifted away from parts of the old Bowery district. Buildings were converted to stores, warehouses, small cinemas, missions, and lodging houses. The campaigns had closed many notorious establishments, but they had not made the Bowery respectable. They had removed some of the activities that once brought large paying crowds. What remained increasingly served men with very little money. During the Great Depression, unemployment sent more homeless men toward the Bowery. New York's economy collapsed in the early 1930s. Relief funds proved inadequate, and people built makeshift shelters throughout the city. Others entered the Bowery's missions, breadlines and flophouses. The street's old reputation for vice was joined by a stronger identity as Skid Row, the destination for men who had lost work, health, family connections, or the ability to remain anywhere more expensive. Police conducted periodic sweeps. Health officials inspected lodging houses. Mission workers distributed food. Newspapers published stories about the Bowery bum as though every man on the street had followed the same route downward. Business groups again suggested renaming the avenue in the 1930s and in 1947, hoping that a new sign might encourage investment. The name remained. By the 1940s and 1950s, the Bowery was widely described as New York's Skid Row. Cheap hotels divided floors into narrow sleeping cubicles. Bars served men who began drinking early and stopped when they ran out of money or consciousness. Used clothing stores, employment agencies, barbershops, pawn shops, missions, restaurant suppliers, and lighting businesses served the population around them. Reformers continued searching for methods to manage alcoholism and homelessness, but public policy still moved between treatment and removal. A man might be sent to Bellevue Hospital, arrested for public intoxication, placed in a shelter, admitted to a mission program, or simply told to keep walking. Every response changed his location for a while. Few changed the conditions that had brought him there. The Third Avenue elevated railway was finally demolished along the Bowery in 1955. For the first time in generations, the centre of the street opened fully to the sky. The removal reduced noise, smoke and shadow, but it also removed the structure that had helped keep rents low and large-scale development away. Sunlight reached storefronts that had spent decades beneath iron tracks. Property owners began looking at the avenue differently. The long campaign to clean up the Bowery had produced real achievements. Police corruption had been exposed. Dangerous lodging systems had been challenged. housing laws became stronger. Some brothels, gambling houses, and exploitative hotels were closed. Parks and playgrounds replaced several of the worst blocks. Missions fed and sheltered men who would otherwise have remained outdoors. The campaign also revealed how often cities confuse poverty with the sight of poverty. When reform improved ventilation, sanitation, fire safety, or access to food, residents benefited. When it simply closed a doorway, conducted a sweep, or moved homeless men onto another block, the street looked cleaner without becoming more humane. The Bowery's poor were repeatedly treated as both the reason for reform and the obstacle preventing it from succeeding. By the middle of the 20th century, many of the gangs, theatres, beer halls, and famous saloons were gone. The street had not returned to respectability. It had become quieter, poorer, and more completely identified with men who had nowhere else to go. Then the elevated railway disappeared, rents began to change, and artists, musicians, developers, and new businesses started noticing buildings that respectable New York had ignored for decades. The next effort to transform the Bowery would not rely mainly on ministers, undercover investigators, police commissioners, or Sunday closing laws. It would arrive through real estate, new culture, rising prices, and a city gradually discovering that the notorious old street occupied land far too valuable to remain unwanted. The next effort to transform the Bowery would not arrive mainly through ministers, police commissioners, or investigators entering saloons in borrowed clothes. It would come through demolition plans, rising land values, cheap studio space, new music, and the slow realization that a street New York had rejected for generations occupied valuable ground between several neighborhoods already beginning to change. When the Third Avenue elevated railway was removed from the Bowery in 1955, sunlight returned to the roadway for the first time in nearly 80 years. Residents could look upward without seeing iron beams, steam, and passing train cars. Storefronts that had spent most of the day in shadow were suddenly exposed. The street became quieter, although quiet on the Bowery remained a relative description. Trucks, buses, horns, bars, lodging houses, and people still produced more than enough noise. Some property owners believed the removal of the railway would immediately improve business and attract investment. The structure had been blamed for darkness, dirt, falling cinders, and low property values. Take it away, they reasoned, and the Bowery might finally become a respectable commercial avenue. The men sleeping in its lodging houses did not disappear with the tracks. Neither did the bars, missions, pawn shops, employment agencies, restaurant supply stores, lighting shops, and narrow hotels divided into sleeping cubicles. The Bowery remained New York's best-known Skid Row. The buildings were brighter from the outside, but the lives inside them had changed very little. Walk along the street on a morning in 1956 and you would still see men waiting outside the Bowery Mission. Others stood near temporary labour offices hoping to be selected for a day of unloading, cleaning, demolition or construction. Bars opened early because many customers had nowhere else to sit. Some lodging houses emptied their rooms during the day, forcing residents onto the sidewalk until they could pay for another night. A man might wake in a small cubicle separated from the next bed by wire mesh, or a wooden partition that did not reach the ceiling. He gathered his coat and shoes, checked his pockets, and stepped outside. Perhaps he had arrived on the Bowery only recently. Perhaps he had been there for 15 years. To the people passing him, the distinction was invisible. In 1957, filmmaker Lionel Rogersen released On the Bowery, a production created after months of observing and speaking with people in the district. It combined documentary methods with a partly arranged story and focused on several men living among the bars, missions and flophouses. The camera did not treat the Bowery as an entertaining tour for outsiders. It stayed close to faces, cheap drinks, exhausted bodies, and conversations between men who understood that promises made while sober often failed by evening. The film later entered the National Film Registry as an important portrait of life on New York's Skid Row. Imagine sitting inside one of those bars while the film was being made. Daylight enters weakly through a dirty front window. Several men are already drinking. One has found work and intends to celebrate before reporting for it, which may cause him to lose the job before it begins. Another is waiting for someone who owes him money. A third sits silently because a glass on the bar allows him to remain indoors. The bartender has seen every version of the same plan. A customer says he will have one drink, find employment, save his wages, and leave the Bowery. The bartender listens without arguing. He knows that some men will manage it. He also knows that many will return to the same stool. On the Bowery made the district visible to audiences who had never entered those rooms, but the city's response to places described as slums often began with a bulldozer. In 1959, a municipal urban renewal proposal threatened a broad section of the neighbourhood around Cooper Square and the Upper Bowery. The plan followed the prevailing belief that old buildings and crowded streets should be cleared and replaced through large-scale redevelopment. Supporters described demolition as progress. Residents heard that their homes, shops and gathering places might be removed for a future designed without them. The Cooper Square Committee formed that year to oppose the clearance plan. Tenants, business owners, artists, older residents and community organisers attended meetings, held demonstrations, spoke at public hearings, and developed their own proposal. Their alternative insisted that displacement be minimised, construction proceed in stages, and existing tenants receive priority in new housing. In 1970, the city adopted the community's alternate plan. The campaign preserved more than 300 buildings and prevented the displacement of several thousand people. This struggle is important because it interrupts the simple story that the old Bowery was cleared and replaced by a new one. Large parts survived because residents refused to accept that improvement required their removal. Picture one of those community meetings in the 1960s. Folding chairs fill a hot room. A city planner displays drawings showing new buildings, open space, and clean streets. The proposal looks orderly on paper, because paper contains no people refusing to move. A tenant asks where she will live while the work is completed. A shopkeeper wants to know whether his business will receive another storefront. An older resident says he has lived on the same block for 40 years and does not intend to leave because someone has coloured his building grey on a map. The planner explains benefits that may arrive years later. The people in the room are concerned about rent due next month. The conflict continued while another population was beginning to see opportunity in the Bowery's neglected buildings. Artists needed large rooms, strong floors, high ceilings, and low rent. The street had former factories, commercial lofts, hotels, meeting halls, and upper floors that landlords struggled to lease. Most were uncomfortable by ordinary residential standards. Heating was unreliable, plumbing could be limited, some buildings lacked legal permission for residential use. The neighbourhood remained associated with alcohol, prostitution, homelessness and crime. That reputation helped keep prices within reach. Artists had lived and worked around the Bowery before the 1960s. At 222 Bowery, a building originally constructed as a young men's Christian institute, studios were occupied at different times by figures including Fernand Léger, Mark Rothko, Michael Goldberg, Linda Benglis, writer William S. Burroughs, and poet John Giorno. The building's history moved from a 19th century effort to protect young men from Bowery vice into a long period as a workplace for people producing some of the most important art and writing associated with post-war downtown New York. A painter renting space there did not arrive because the Bowery had become fashionable. He arrived because the room was large and the rent was possible. The studio might have bare floors, exposed pipes, old windows and a freight elevator that worked only when treated with patience. In winter, the artist wore several layers while painting. In summer, the windows remained open despite traffic and street noise. Canvases leaned against walls that had belonged to another kind of institution decades earlier. A table served as kitchen, desk, workbench and dining room. Outside, men entered the flophouses. Inside, paintings that would later hang in expensive galleries were being made beneath leaking ceilings. There was no clear border separating these populations. Artists bought coffee in the same lunchrooms, passed the same mission lines, and entered bars that still served long-term Bowery residents. Some treated the neighbourhood respectfully. Others saw its poverty as atmosphere, something that made their own lives feel more authentic while remaining confident they could leave when necessary. As loft prices increased in nearby Soho, more artists looked toward the Bowery during the 1970s. The pattern was already becoming familiar. People needing cheap space moved into an area rejected by conventional investors. Their presence generated cultural attention. Galleries, visitors, and new businesses followed. Property owners noticed. Rents rose, and the people who had made the area interesting began struggling to remain there. The Bowery stayed relatively affordable longer than Soho because its homeless population, prostitution trade, lodging houses, and enduring reputation continued to discourage wealthier residents well into the late 20th century. The New York fiscal crisis of the 1970s slowed redevelopment and deepened neglect. Buildings across the Lower East Side were abandoned or lost through fire. Landlords stopped maintaining properties that produced little income. Vacant lots accumulated rubbish. City services declined. The Bowery remained active, but much of its activity occurred in aging buildings that no one expected to become valuable soon. Restaurant equipment stores formed one of the street's most stable commercial groups. Their windows displayed metal sinks, industrial ovens, counters, chairs, tables, and stacks of kitchen tools. Lighting businesses occupied other storefronts. These trays did not require a fashionable location. They needed deep interiors, delivery access, and customers willing to travel for specialized goods. Walk into one of those stores, and the Bowery outside briefly disappears. Metal shelves rise toward the ceiling. Restaurant owners inspect used equipment. A clerk knows the exact width of every stove in the building. Dust rests on objects no one has requested for years. A customer starting a small diner bargains over a refrigerator because every dollar spent on equipment is a dollar unavailable for rent. Several doors away, a very different business was preparing to change music. Hilly Crystal had begun leasing the Old Palace Bar at 315 Bowery in 1969. The location stood beneath the Palace Hotel, one of the Bowery's lodging houses. Crystal initially hoped to maintain some of the existing customers while attracting musicians and artists. In 1973, he opened a club called CBGB, initials representing country, bluegrass, and blues, the music he expected to present. The additional letters, OMFUG, referred to other music for what he called uplifting gourmandizers. His plan changed when young bands began asking for a place to perform original songs. The room did not look like the birthplace of an international musical movement. It was narrow, dirty, and connected physically and socially to the old Bowery. The bar and fixtures carried decades of use. The toilets became famous for reasons that had nothing to do with design. Bands loaded equipment past lodging house residents and customers who had been drinking there long before anyone used the word punk to describe the music. Crystal's essential rule was that performers should play original material. This gave inexperienced bands something they could not easily find elsewhere, a stage on which they were not expected to imitate popular records. Television performed there. Patti Smith appeared there. The Ramones developed their short, fast songs before audiences standing only a few feet away. Blondie, Talking Heads, and many other groups became associated with the club. They did not all sound alike, and many resisted the punk label, but the room connected them. CBGB became the centre of a new downtown scene because it allowed artists to experiment publicly before record companies or large audiences understood what they were doing. The Library of Congress has described the club as the epicentre of the Bowery punk world in which Blondie and its contemporaries developed. Imagine entering on an early evening before the club became famous. There may be fewer people in the audience than on stage. A band plays too loudly for the size of the room. The singer has little conventional technique and no intention of apologising for it. Amplifiers produce feedback. Someone near the bar continues talking throughout the set. A resident from upstairs enters for a drink, looks at the performers, and decides they are not the strangest thing the building has contained. The music is rough, because everything surrounding it is rough. The club has no polished machinery for turning performers into stars. A group carries its own equipment, makes its own posters, contacts its friends, and returns the following week if Cristal allows it. Failure is public and inexpensive. That freedom depended partly on the Bowery's low status. A club producing unfamiliar noise could operate there because few powerful neighbours complained. The street that respectable New York had avoided provided room for a culture that respectable music businesses had not requested. The relationship was not simple. Musicians and artists benefited from low rents created partly by poverty, neglect and homelessness. They did not cause all those conditions, but their success eventually helped change how outsiders valued the neighbourhood. A photographer, journalist or music fan who once feared the Bowery now came deliberately to visit it. The same reputation that had kept investors away became useful when sold as authenticity. Elsewhere on the street, residents were reclaiming neglected land through a different kind of work. In the early 1970s, activists known as the Green Guerrillas planted tree pits, window boxes, and vacant lots. At the northeast corner of Bowery and Houston Street, Liz Christie and other volunteers cleared rubbish from an abandoned parcel. In 1974, the city agreed to lease the site to the Bowery Houston Community Farm and Garden for $1 per month. It became widely recognised as New York's first official community garden and was later named for Christie. The work began with garbage. Volunteers carried out broken materials, loosened poor soil, built planting beds, and tried to keep new growth alive beside one of downtown Manhattan's busiest intersections. A passerby accustomed to seeing the lot filled with debris now saw vegetables, flowers, and people working together. The garden did not eliminate poverty or repair every abandoned building. It demonstrated that residents could improve a place without removing themselves from it. During the 1980s and 1990s, the Bowery changed unevenly. Art galleries and performance spaces appeared. Old lofts became increasingly desirable. Restaurants opened for customers who were not searching for the cheapest possible meal. Apartment renovations brought people willing to pay rents that earlier residents could not imagine. At the same time, flophouses, missions, supply stores, and bars remained. A person could leave an expensive gallery opening and pass a man preparing to sleep in a cubicle a few buildings away. The contrast that had always defined the Bowery became sharper because wealth and poverty were no longer separated by several blocks. They shared the same sidewalk. The Cooper Square Committee continued fighting displacement and eventually helped create permanently affordable housing through a mutual housing association and community land trust. Formerly city-owned buildings were renovated without surrendering all of them to market prices. The long campaign showed that gentrification was not an automatic natural process. Decisions about ownership, subsidies, tenant rights and land control could preserve space for low-income residents when organisations possessed enough persistence to force those decisions. Most residents did not experience neighbourhood change through planning language. They experienced it through rent notices. A tenant heard that a nearby building had sold. A store owner learned that the lease would not be renewed. A new restaurant opened where a supply shop had operated for decades. An artist who had moved into the Bowery because Soho became too expensive discovered that the same process had followed him. CBGB survived long enough to become a recognised institution, but recognition did not guarantee control of the property. A lease dispute began in the 2000s. The club closed on October 15, 2006 after 33 years, with Patti Smith leading the final performance. The space later became an upscale clothing store that preserved parts of the old interior while selling goods at prices far removed from the world in which the club had developed. There are few images that summarise modern New York more efficiently than a punk club becoming a designer boutique. Some people regarded the conversion as an insult. Others argued that preservation of interior features was better than complete destruction. Tourists continued visiting the address, photographing walls, stickers and marks left from the club. The space remained valuable because of the history created by people who could no longer afford to operate there. That same period brought a new cultural landmark to the street. The new museum constructed its dedicated building at 235 Bowery, a stack of pale, offset forms that looked deliberately different from the older brick structures around it. Its arrival confirmed that the Bowery was no longer outside the accepted art world. A major contemporary art institution now used the street itself as part of its identity. The contrast was difficult to miss. The Bowery Mission remained nearby, continuing work that had begun in 1879. Its building at 227 Bowery, occupied by the Mission since 1909, was designated a New York City landmark in 2012 in recognition of its architectural and social history. Men and women still arrived needing meals, shelter, recovery services, clothing or assistance. The Mission's survival demonstrated that redevelopment had not removed the need that first brought it to the street. A museum visitor could stand outside studying contemporary architecture while a meal line formed a short distance away. That is not an unusual contradiction on the Bowery. It is almost the street's traditional arrangement. Luxury hotels, expensive apartments, galleries, restaurants, and fashion stores gradually replaced many businesses that depended on low rents. Several restaurant equipment and lighting shops remained, though their numbers declined. Old lodging houses closed, converted, or reduced operations. New residents arrived without remembering when the Bowery's name had been used as a synonym for complete personal ruin. Preservationists responded by documenting the street's buildings and cultural history. The Bowery Historic District nomination identified a remarkably varied collection extending from Chatham Square toward Cooper Square, including early houses, banks, lofts, former hotels, commercial buildings, institutional structures, and sites connected with entertainment, reform, homelessness, art, and labour. The value of the Bowery did not lie in architectural uniformity. Its buildings rarely matched neatly. The significance came from the accumulation. This is worth remembering because reinvention often creates the illusion that whatever came before was waiting to be replaced. The Bowery was never empty. Even at its poorest, people were living, working, organising, creating music, feeding strangers, repairing restaurant stoves, painting canvases, and trying to make enough money for another night indoors. Development did not bring life to a dead street. It brought a different kind of money to a street whose existing life had been undervalued. By 2026, the transformation was visible at almost every point along the avenue. The expanded new museum building opened on March 21st of that year, doubling down on the Bowery as an international destination for contemporary art. The street outside still carried buses, delivery trucks, restaurant workers, tourists, residents, people seeking help, and customers moving between old businesses and new ones. Walk there now, and the old Bowery does not appear in one complete scene. You find it in fragments. It is in the shape of a narrow building that once held rented rooms. It is in the front of a bank constructed when the avenue wanted to prove its respectability. It is in the Mission windows above a sidewalk where people still wait for assistance. It is in a former theatre site, an old saloon interior, a restaurant supply sign, a community garden, or a doorway through which musicians once carried cheap amplifiers. The crowd has changed, but the street continues performing several roles at once. It remains a route between neighbourhoods. It is still a commercial corridor. It is a place where wealth and hardship pass close enough to see one another, even when neither knows what to say. The Bowery became notorious because New York placed so much of what it feared, needed, enjoyed, and refused to admit along the same road. It held slaughterhouses when the city needed meat, theatres when workers wanted entertainment, saloons when men needed public rooms, lodging houses when labourers could not afford homes, missions when the city failed to provide shelter, and studios when artists needed space no one else valued. Then the city wanted the space back. Yet beneath the hotels, galleries, apartments, boutiques and museum walls, the original road still follows its old direction through Manhattan. It continues carrying people north and south, just as it did when wagons moved between New Amsterdam and the farms beyond town. Most pedestrians do not stop to think about the fields, cattle, gangs, beer halls, bread lines, flophouses, painters, or punk bands that occupied the same ground. They wait for the light to change, cross the street, and continue walking while the Bowery adds their footsteps to everything it has already kept.